Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping out of the familiar modern world of paved roads and locked doors, and we're heading back to a time when the horizon was the only border that mattered. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a sea butt. There's no water. Instead, there is grass. Tall, golden stalks of the Pontic-Caspian steppe that stretch out for thousands of miles in every direction, swaying in a wind that hasn't touched a building for a week. The air is sharp with the smell of wild herbs and horse sweat. You hear a rhythmic thumping in the distance, a low vibration in the soles of your feet that tells you something fast is coming. You look toward the sun, squinting against the glare, and you see them, silhouettes that move with a fluid, terrifying grace, appearing less like men on horses and more like a single, multi-legged predator. You're watching the Scythians. Now, I should probably mention that if you were actually standing there in your current pajamas, you probably wouldn't survive the next 5 minutes, mainly because you'd look like a very confused target for a high-velocity bronze arrowhead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so go ahead and post your location and local time in the comments. It's always surreal to see how far these stories travel while we all tucked away in our own little corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the wind pick up, tugging at your clothes as you adjust to the sheer scale of this landscape. This isn't just a field, it's a geographical highway that connects the edge of Europe to the gates of China. To the ancient Greeks, this was the end of the civilized world, a place where the monstrous lived. But for you, as you settle into this second-person reality, this is home. Or at least the home of the people who are about to change the way humanity thinks about warfare, distance, and the animal kingdom. The people around you, these Scythians, didn't just ride horses. That's a modern way of looking at it. To you, in this moment, the horse is your legs, your status, and your survival. While the rest of the world is still trying to figure out how to march in straight lines, without tripping over their own bronze shields, you are part of a culture that has mastered the first great revolution in mobility. You see a young boy, maybe no older than 6 or 7, galloping past you. He isn't holding the mane, hands leaning back, hands free, casually checking the fletching on an arrow. It's effortless. It's also deeply unsettling to any civilized observer from the Mediterranean. Historians still argue whether the Scythians were the very first to domesticate the horse for riding, or if they were simply the first to turn that bond into a perfected weapon system. Regardless of who came first, by the time you're standing here in the 8th century BCE, they have become the undisputed masters of the grass sea. You watch them move, and you realize they don't have cities. Why build walls when you can just move the entire neighborhood? Their homes are massive wagons, pulled by teams of oxen, covered in felt and leather, carrying everything they own. It's the original mobile home, though I doubt your local DMV would know how to register a dwelling that requires 16 oxen and has a decorative fringe made of enemy scalps. There is a mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in the barbarian labels. The Scythians weren't just a single tribe. They were a vast, loose confederation of nomadic groups sharing a language and a terrifyingly effective way of life. They were the bridge between East and West. Because you're here, you notice the little things, the way they use every part of the environment. You see a warrior repairing a strap, and he's using a strange, translucent glue. You find out later it's made from the boil-down swim bladders of sturgeon from the nearby rivers. It's a quirky, fringe tidbit, but it shows the resourcefulness of a people who have no hardware stores, but plenty of fish and fire. The sun begins to dip lower, casting long, spindly shadows across the dirt. You feel a sense of isolation that's hard to describe. In the modern world, we are always somewhere. On the steppe, you are everywhere and nowhere at once. This lack of a fixed point is what made the Scythians so haunting to the settled empires. You can't conquer a people who have no capital city to burn. You couldn't trap an army that can ride 60 miles in a day and disappear into the tall grass like smoke. You walk toward a group of men and women sitting around a low fire. Yes, women-toothed Greeks weren't entirely making up those Amazon stories, though they certainly added some flair for the theater crowds. You see them checking their gear? The primary tool of their trade is leaning against a wagon, the goritos. It's a specialized combination case that holds both the bow and dozens of arrows. It's the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world. You reach out to touch the leather, and it feels tough, cured by months of sun and wind. As you settle in by the fire, you realize that the peacefulness of the sunset is an illusion. Every person here is a finely tuned instrument of violence. Their entire culture is built around the bow. To them, a man who cannot shoot from the saddle is barely a man at all. It's a harsh world, one where you either master the horizon or are swallowed by it. You take a sip of a pungent, sour liquid offered to you, fermented mare's milk, and try not to gag. It's an acquired taste, much like the lifestyle itself. The conversation around the fire is low, a language of sharp consonants and flowing vowels that sounds like the wind itself. They aren't talking about philosophy or democracy. They're talking about the quality of the wood in the latest shipment of bows, the movement of the herds, and the rumors of a great king to the south who thinks his golden throne makes him invincible. You smile to yourself, knowing what that great king is in for. He's used to fighting men who stand still. He's not ready for an enemy that fights like a ghost. As the stars begin to poke through the darkening purple of the sky, you look at your own hands. They're getting calloused. You're starting to understand the rhythm of this place. The Parthian shot isn't just a trick move. It's the culmination of 1,000 years of living in the saddle. It's the ultimate expression of Scythian freedom, the ability to strike while moving away, to have the last word in every argument, and to leave nothing but dust for your enemies to grasp at. The fire crackles, sending a plume of sparks toward the Milky Way. You realize that to understand how they haunted Rome for centuries, you have to understand the bow itself. It wasn't just a stick and a string. It was a piece of high-tech engineering that took years to build and a lifetime to master. You close your eyes, the smell of the grass, and the horses lulling you into a shallow sleep, knowing that tomorrow, the real work begins. You're going to learn how to build the weapon that broke empires. You wake up just as the first sliver of gray light begins to peel back the darkness of the steppe. The air is surprisingly damp, a heavy dew clinging to the felt walls of the wagons. But inside the tent of the master belawyer, the air is dry and smells of wood smoke and something sweet and pungent animal glue. You're about to witness the birth of a superpower, and it isn't made of iron or gold. It's made of organic matter, layered with a precision that would make a modern engineer sweat. The Scythian composite bow is a miracle of ancient physics, and as you watch the craftsmen work, you realize this isn't a weekend project. This is a process that can take up to 3 or 4 years to complete, a slow-motion assembly that requires the patience of a saint and the hands of a surgeon. The master motioned for you to sit. In front of him lies a strip of seasoned wood, usually maple or cornelian cherry. This is the soul of the bow, but on its own, it's weak. To make it a Scythian bow, he must transform it into a composite. You watch him take a piece of horn, not just any horn, but the curved, translucent layers from a water buffalo or a mountain goat. He grinds it down until it's thin and flexible, then scores the surface with a flint knife. This horn will form the belly of the bow, the side facing you. When the bow is drawn, the horn resists being squeezed, pushing back with a force that stores incredible amounts of energy. If you tried to do this with a standard piece of European yew, it would just snap, but the horn thrives under the pressure. It's the original high compression spring. Then comes the back of the bow, the side facing your enemy. For this, the craftsman produces a bundle of dried yellowish threads. You touch them, and they feel like stiff wire. This is sinew, harvested from the Achilles tendons of deer or oxen. This is where the fringe science of the ancient world really shines. Sinew is incredibly strong in tension. It loves to be stretched. The craftsman shreds it into fibers and soaks it in that sturgeon bladder glue you smelled earlier. Historians still argue whether the specific ratio of fish glue to sinew was a guarded tribal secret or if it varied based on the humidity of the region. But regardless, the result is a biological laminate that is actually stronger than the sum of its parts. As you watch him apply the sinew in thin, overlapping layers, you notice the bow is being glued in a shape that looks entirely wrong. It's being curved away from the string, forming a tight C shape or even a circle. This is the recurve. It means that even before you pull the string back, the materials are already under immense tension. You might find it funny to think about, but this bow is essentially a weaponized version of a coiled snake, just waiting for the latch to drop. You probably wouldn't survive the snapping of a bow that fails during this phase. If the glue gives way while it's being strung, the energy release can shatter the wooden core and send shards of horn flying like shrapnel. There is a mainstream historical fact here that often surprises people. because these bows were held together by water-soluble animal glue. They were terrifyingly vulnerable to moisture. You see the archers obsessively wrapping their bows in leather and storing them in waterproof cases. If a Scythian army got caught in a 3-day rainstorm, their high-tech weaponry could literally melt in their hands, turning back into a pile of smelly wood and soggy tendons. This is why you see the Scythians pushing deep into the humid forests of northern Europe or the damp jungles of the south. They are a creature of the dry, open air. The craftsman hands you a finished limb to inspect. It's surprisingly heavy for its size. Unlike the massive 6-foot longbows of the English, this weapon is barely 3 feet long. It's designed for the cramped quarters of a horse's back. You can hold it in one hand while your other guides a stallion through a marsh. It's a compact sniper rifle. One quirky tidbit you notice is that the tips of the bowthacias are made of bone and are completely rigid. They act as levers, giving the archer more mechanical advantage as they pull. It's a bit like having a pulley system without the wheels. You spend the afternoon helping the master scrape down the excess glue. It's tedious work, and your fingers start to ache, but there's a rhythm to it. He tells you, through gestures and a few shared words, that a bow made this year won't be ready to fire until the seasons have turned twice. The glue must cure perfectly. If you rush it, the layers will delaminate the first time you try to draw it in the cold winter air. It's a lesson in nomadic long-term planning. For people who move every week, they have a remarkably long-view perspective on their technology. As the sun sets, the master takes a finished bow and strings it. It takes 2 men and a specialized step-through technique just to get the loop over the notch. The tension in the air is palpable. When the string finally seats, the bow hums a low, vibrating note that you can feel in your teeth. He hands it to you. It's tiny, elegant, and looks almost like a toy until you try to pull it. You tug at the string, and it doesn't budge. You give it everything you have, your muscles shaking, and you barely move it for inches. He laughs, a dry, wheezing sound, and takes it back. With a fluid motion that looks like he's stretching a rubber band, he pulls the string all the way to his ear. You realize then that the bow isn't just a tool, it's a physical requirement. To be a Scythian warrior, your entire upper body has to be rebuilt by years of this specific strain. Your skeletal structure actually changes. Archaeologists can identify Scythian remains just by the thickened bone density in the drawing arm and the slight twist in the spine. You are looking at a society of biological hybrids half-man-half-genie of war. Tonight, as you lie down on your bed of furs, the smell of the fish glue lingers in your hair. You think about the Roman legions you'll eventually face. They have their iron breastplates and their heavy wooden shields, and they think they are the peak of military technology, but they are relying on static defense. You, meanwhile, are sleeping next to a weapon that is a masterpiece of organic chemistry and kinetic potential. You realize that the haunting of Rome didn't start on the battlefield. It started here, in a smoky tent with a man gluing fish bladders to a piece of goat horn. You close your eyes, the image of that taut, vibrating string burned into your mind, wondering if you'll ever have the strength to pull it yourself. You wake up with the ghost of that vibrating bowstring still humming in your ears. The morning air on the steppe is crisp, almost sharp enough to cut, and as you step out from the wagon, you see a group of warriors practicing at the edge of the camp. They aren't just shooting at targets, they are testing the very limits of the physics you saw being glued together yesterday. To understand why the Parthian shot was so terrifying, you have to understand the sheer violent energy stored in that recurved shape. When you look at a Scythian bow unstrung, it curves into a C that faces away from the archer. To string it, you have to force it across its natural grain, a process that stores a massive amount of potential energy before you even begin your draw. You walk over to a stack of seasoned targets, thick planks of wood covered in layers of cured leather. One of the archers, a man with skin the color of old parchment and eyes crinkled from decades of squinting at the horizon, beckons you over. He wants you to see the impact. He draws a short, heavy arrow fletched with eagle feathers. As he pulls back, you see the limbs of the bow deform, bending into a shape that looks like it should snap. This is the Hooke's law of the ancient world in action. The force required to extend the spring is proportional to the distance you stretch it. But because of the composite materials, that force doesn't just increase linearly, it stays high throughout the entire stroke. He releases there is no twang like you hear in the movies. It's a thwackchus sound of air being punched out of the way. The arrow hits the target 50 yards away with such velocity that it doesn't just stick, It punches through the wood and the leather, the tip protruding 4 inches out the back. You probably would unsurvive that, even if you were wearing the best bronze muscle cuirass the Greeks could forge. The arrow would simply treat your armor like a slightly thicker skin. Historians still argue whether the Scythian bow's effective range truly reached the 500-yard mark mentioned in some ancient exaggerations, or if its killing zone was a more realistic 150 to 200 yards. But even at the lower estimate, it outclassed almost everything else on the battlefield. The physics are simple but brutal. Because the bow is short, the tip's speed, the speed at which the ends of the bow return to their original position, is incredibly high. A long, heavy wooden bow is like a slow-moving freight train. But the Scythian composite is a Formula 1 car. It's all about the acceleration of the projectile. You notice something quirky as you pick up one of the arrows. The heads are unjust pointed. Many of them have a trilobate, or 3-bladed design. They look like tiny aerodynamic propellers. This wasn't just for show. The 3 blades created a wound that was almost impossible to stitch or plug. It caused massive internal bleeding and allowed the arrow to spin slightly in flight, increasing its stability. It's a fringe detail that reveals a deep understanding of ballistics. Long before the word ballistics existed, you realize that while the Romans were perfecting the art of the heavy pylama, javelin meant to be thrown once. The Scythians were perfecting a weapon that could be fired 20 times a minute with the same deadly kinetic energy. The old archer hands you a thumb ring. It's a piece of carved bone shaped like a heavy ring with a wide flange. He shows you how to hook the string using your thumb instead of your fingers. This is the Eastern or Mongolian draw. By using the thumb, you can draw a much heavier weight without shredding your fingertips, and it allows for a cleaner release. More importantly for our journey, it's the only way to shoot effectively from a moving horse. If you try to use a 3-finger Mediterranean draw while bouncing at 20 miles per hour, the arrow will fall off the rest. But the thumb draw locks the arrow against the bow, turning the weapon and the rider into a single unified machine. You try the thumb ring, and it feels awkward, like trying to write with your non-dominant hand. You pull the string, and you feel the stacking that point where the bow's resistance increases exponentially. It feels like the bow is fighting you. It wants to return to its C shape, and it will do so with a violence that can easily dislocate your shoulder if you are prepared. The archer laughs at your straining muscles, nudging his companion and making a joke about city-dweller arms that you need a translator to understand. As you stand there, nursing your aching thumb, you look out over the horses grazing nearby. You realize that the physics of the bow are only half the story. The bow is the engine, but the horse is the chassis. To pull off the Parthian shot, you don't just need the strength to draw the bow. You need the core stability to do it while your platform is jumping over marmot holes and turning on a dime. You look at the bow again, seeing it now not as a weapon, but as a masterpiece of stored potential. It's a battery made of wood and sinew, waiting to be discharged into the chest of a legionnaire. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores this. The Scythians were often hired as police in ancient Athens. Imagine that the cradle of democracy felt so vulnerable that they hired these barbarian archers to keep order. Why? Because nobody wanted to mess with the person who could put an arrow through your neck from across a crowded square. Before you even heard the string snap, they were the snipers of antiquity, respected and feared in equal measure. The sun is high now, and the heat is starting to shimmer off the grass. You see a cloud of dust on the horizon, a group of riders, returning from a hunt or a scout. They are moving fast, and as they approach, they begin a circle of fire, riding in a loop and peppering a stationary hay bale with arrows. It's a blur of movement. You see the archers leaning out, their bodies seemingly disconnected from the jarring motion of the horses. This is where the physics meets the art. You're starting to see the how, but you haven't yet seen the why. You haven't seen the moment where the hunter becomes the prey and the retreat becomes the attack. You walk back toward the wagons, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the metallic scent of the bronze arrowheads. You're exhausted just from watching, but your mind is racing. You've seen the glue, the horn, the sinew, and the tension. You've felt the power that can punch through a shield. Now, you need to understand how they stay on the horse long enough to use it. You need to learn the secrets of the Scythian seat and why the lack of a stirrup didn't stop them from conquering the world. You approach one of the grazing horses, a sturdy, deep-chested mare with a coat the color of dried clay. To look at her, she's not the towering, elegant warhorse of a medieval knight. She's smaller, shaggier, and looks like she could survive a winter eating nothing but frozen twigs, which she probably has. This is the steppe pony, the unsung hero of the Scythian war machine. You reach out to touch her flank, and the muscle feels like braided cable. But as you look at her back, you notice something that makes your modern stomach do a little flip. There are no stirrups. There is no habactic wooden saddle to lock you in place. You're looking at a simple leather pad stuffed with deer hair and cinched with a few rawhide straps. You probably wouldn't survive a brisk trot on this setup, let alone a chaotic battle, without falling off and becoming a very flat piece of the scenery. You climb up, feeling the horse's warmth through the thin leather of the pad. It feels impossibly precarious. Without stirrups to brace your weight, your legs feel useless, dangling like loose ropes. However, a Scythian rider approaches and gestures for you to grip with your thighs. This is the secret of the ancient seat. Historians still argue whether the lack of stirrups actually limited the power of a horse archer, or if it actually made them more flexible. Some scholars suggest that without stirrups, the rider's body acts as a natural shock absorber, isolating the upper torso from the jarring thump-thump of the hooves. This soft seat is exactly what allows an archer to keep their aim steady while the horse is in a full-out gallop. As you try to find your balance, you notice a quirky fringe tidbit about the gear. The saddle pads often have two stuffed bolsters at the front and back. They aren't quite a saddle tree, but they act like clips, hugging your thighs and the base of your spine. It's a bit like being wedged into a cockpit rather than sitting on a chair. You realize that the Scythians did need stirrups because they did fight by pushing against the horse. They fought by becoming part of the horse. You see a rider nearby demonstrate this by leaning so far over the side of his mount that he's nearly horizontal, his legs locked around the horse's barrel as he scoops a fallen whip off the ground without slowing down. It's a display of core strength that would put a modern gymnast to shame. There is a mainstream historical fact that supports this incredible bond. Scythians were often buried with their horses. In the massive burial mounds known as kurgans, archaeologists find the remains of stallions outfitted in elaborate masks that make them look like stags or griffins. To you, in this moment, the horse isn't a vehicle. It's a family member, a business partner, and a life insurance policy. You notice that the horses are surprisingly calm. They don't spook at the sound of the whistling arrows or the shouting warriors. This is because they've been desensitized since they were foals, raised in the middle of the camp where the noise of war is just background music. You try to move the mare into a slow walk. Without the leverage of stirrups, every turn of the horse is a conversation between your inner thighs and her ribs. You feel a deep sense of vulnerability. If you were a Roman legionary, you'd be looking at this and thinking, one good push and they're off. But that's the trap. You can't push what you can't catch. You see the archers around you practicing the hovera moment in the horse. Escate, where all four hooves are off the ground. It's a split second of perfect stillness in the middle of a chaotic stride that they tell you through signs is the only time you let the arrow fly. If you shoot when a hoof is hitting the ground, the vibration will throw your aim off by a foot. You notice something else about the Scythian riding style. They don't use heavy bits. The bridles are light, often decorated with intricate gold or bone carvings of animals, eating other animals, the animal-style art they are famous for. The horse is controlled mostly by weight shifts and neck reining. This leaves the rider's hands free. You watch a warrior ride past you at a brisk canter. He has no reins in his hands. He's busy braiding a new bowstring while his horse navigates a patch of uneven ground by itself. It's a level of autonomy that seems magical, but it's just the result of two species living in total lockstep for 5,000 years. The rider who helped you up now shows you a trick. He has you sit on the horse while it's stationary and try to turn your torso all the way around to look at the horse's tail. It's harder than it looks. Your hips want to follow your shoulders, which would pull you right off the leather pad. To do the Parthian shot, you have to decouple your upper body from your lower body. Your legs must remain a vice grip on the horse while your waist becomes a turret. You feel the strain in your obliques almost instantly. It's a physical language you haven't learned yet, a way of twisting that feels like you're trying to wring out a wet towel. Remember that sturgeon bladder glue from earlier? You see its cousin here in the horse gear. The leather of the bridle is treated with fish oils to keep it supple in the freezing steppe nights. Everything is interconnected. The fish in the river, the horse on the grass, the bird in the sky providing feathers for the arrows. You're beginning to see that the perfected shot wasn't just a move, it was an ecosystem. The horse provides the mobility, the bow provides the power, and the rider provides the lethal intent. As you finally slide down from the mare, your legs feeling like jelly, you look back at the group of warriors. They are starting to move faster now, the circle of fire becoming a blur. You're starting to understand that the Romans' nightmare wasn't just an arrow, it was a ghost on horseback that could shoot backwards while fleeing. You've seen the bow and you've felt the horse. Now, you ready to see the move itself, the moment of the 180-degree turn that turned the tide of history. You're ready to see the Parthian shot in action. The dust from the practice field settles on your skin like a second layer of clothing, and the smell of ozone and trampled grass fills your lungs. You're standing at the edge of the kill zone, watching the most famous maneuver in the history of light cavalry. It's a move so iconic that its name has survived for 2 millennia as a metaphor for the final biting word in an argument. But here, in the shadow of the Scythian wagons, the Parthian shot isn't a metaphor. It's a brutal, high-speed solution to a tactical problem. You see, the Scythians and their later successors, the Parthians, realized something profound. An enemy is never more vulnerable than when they think they are winning. You watch a veteran warrior named Targetos prepare for a run. He doesn't look like a hero from a Greek epic. He's bow-legged, his face is a map of scars, and he smells like sour milk and old leather. He kicks his horse into a dead gallop, riding away from a line of wooden targets that represent a pursuing infantry line. At first, it looks like a retreat. To an untrained Aese, a Roman centurion eager for a promotion, Targetos is running away in terror. But as the horse reaches top speed, something impossible happens. Without slowing down, Targetos lets go of the reins. He twists his entire upper body 180 degrees, his hips remaining locked forward against the horse's flanks, while his chest faces directly backward over the horse's tail. The sheer biomechanical weirdness of this move hits you immediately. You probably wouldn't survive trying this on your first go. The centrifugal force alone would likely pitch you headfirst into the dirt, where your horse would then accidentally provide a very permanent weight loss solution. But Targetos is stable. He draws his composite bow, the one we saw being cured for years and for a split second. He is a statue of tension amidst a whirlwind of motion. The arrow screams back the way he came, burying itself dead center in the chest of a target he is technically moving away from at 30 miles per hour. Historians still argue whether the term Parthian shot is actually a linguistic pun. In Latin, Parthica refers to the Parthian people, but it sounds remarkably similar to the word pecta, meaning agreement or faked. Regardless of the etymology, the physics are terrifying. When you fire an arrow backward from a moving platform, you are essentially subtracting the horse's speed from the arrow's velocity relative to the ground, but because the bow is so powerful, the arrow still carries enough kinetic energy to punch through armor. More importantly, the relative speed of the arrow hitting a pursuer is increased because the enemy is running into the shot. It's a hidden collision at the molecular level. You notice a quirky fringe tidbit as you watch him reload. Targetos doesn't look at his quiver. He feels for the arrows, which are knocked and ready in his goritos. His eyes never leave the pursuer. This allows him to maintain a constant stream of fire. Some ancient accounts claim a skilled archer could keep 3 arrows in the air at once, one hitting the target, one halfway there, and one just leaving the string. While that might be a bit of war correspondent exaggeration, the reality you're seeing isn't far off. It's a semi-automatic weapon system powered by muscle and sinew. There is a mainstream historical fact that makes this move so effective: the psychological break. Imagine you are a foot soldier. You've been marching for weeks, and finally, the barbarians turn tail and run. You break formation, screaming in triumph, dropping your heavy shield to run faster so you can catch them and end this war. And then, the man you are chasing suddenly turns into a turret. He doesn't stop. He doesn't even look like he's trying. He just glances over his shoulder and he races your front rank. The retreat was never a retreat. It was a transition into a different phase of the attack. You walk over to the target. Targetos just hit. The arrow hasn't just hit the wood. It's vibrating with a frequency that makes a low, haunting whistle. Some Scythian arrows had hollow bone whistles attached to the tips. Imagine 1,000 of these being fired at once while the archers are fleeing. The sound alone would be enough to make a superstitious soldier drop to his knees. It's a choir of the damned. You touch the fletching vulture feathers, tilted at a slight angle to induce a spin. These people didn't just invent a move, they perfected the ballistics of deception. Targetaus circles back, his horse barely even breathing hard. He looks at you and gestures to the bow. He wants you to try the twist, just the twist, while standing on the ground. You plant your feet and try to rotate your shoulders until they are parallel with your heels. Your spine pops like a bag of chips. You realize that to do this from a horse, your core muscles have to be like iron bands. You're starting to see why the Romans, with their heavy armor and rigid formations, found this so haunting. It was a style of war that ignored all the rules. You don't stand and fight, you flow and sting. As the sun starts to bake the earth, you see a group of younger riders practicing the move in tandem. They move in a Cantabrian circle, a rotating loop where each rider fires a Parthian shot as they peel away from the front. It creates a literal vortex of arrows. You realize that if you're the one being shot at, there is no safe direction. The front of the enemy is dangerous, and the back of the enemy is somehow even more dangerous. You spend the rest of the morning trying to mimic the hand-eye coordination required. It's not just about the shot, it's about the timing. You have to release at the exact apex of the horse's stride, that hover we talked about earlier. If you miss that window, the vibration of the horse's hooves will turn your lethal strike into a warning shot. You're beginning to understand that the Scythians weren't just lucky or wild, they were practitioners of a highly technical, disciplined form of kinetic art. Tonight, as you sit back and watch the riders groom their mounts, you think about the word haunted. It's the right word. Rome wasn't just beaten by the Parthian shot, they were traumatized by it. It broke their sense of how the world was supposed to work. You close your eyes, and all you can see is the image of Targetinos, looking back over his shoulder with a calm, predatory smile, while his horse carries him away into the safety of the endless grass. Tomorrow, you'll see how this single move was scaled up to dismantle an entire Persian empire. The golden glow of the afternoon begins to stretch the shadows of the Scythian wagons into long, thin fingers across the steppe. You've mastered the feel of the bow and the precarious balance of the seat, but now you're about to see how these individual skills coalesce into a grand, frustrating strategy of disappearance. We are stepping into a historical moment, the late 6th century BC, where the mighty Persian Empire, led by Darius the Great, decides it has finally had enough of the restless nomads. Darius marches into your territory with an army of 700,000 men, a glittering forest of spears and shields that should, by all logic, crush your people in a single afternoon. But you aren't standing in a line waiting for him. You are part of the vanishing army. As you ride with a small scouting party, you see the massive Persian column on the horizon, a slow-moving snake of dust and bronze. Your commanders don't look worried, they look bored. You probably wouldn't survive a direct charge into that Persian phalanx, but that's the beauty of Scythian tactics. You simply refuse to be there. Every time Darius's scouts think they've pinned you down, you vanish. You aren't just retreating, you are practicing scorched earth on a continental scale. As you move, your group stops at every well, filling them with stones and sand. You burn the very grass your horses were eating an hour ago, leaving nothing but a black, smoldering wasteland for the Persians to march over. Historians still argue whether the Scythian scorched earth policy was a pre-planned grand strategy or a desperate, spontaneous reaction to the sheer size of the Persian invasion. Regardless, it turned the environment itself into a weapon. You watch the Persian soldiers, thousands of miles from home, looking at the blackened earth with hollow eyes. They came for a battle, for glory, and for loot. Instead, they found a void. There are no cities for them to capture, no granaries to raid, and no enemies to pin against a river. You are a ghost army, and the steppe is your haunted house. One quirky fringe tidbit from this campaign involves a message sent from the Scythian kings to Darius Set. Instead of a formal surrender or a declaration of war, they sent him a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. Darius' advisors tried to spin it as a sign of submission, the Scythians giving up their land and water, but the truth was much darker. The message actually meant, unless you can fly like a bird, hide in the earth like a mouse, or leap through the marshes like a frog, you will not return home, for you will be pierced by these arrows. It's S, the ancient world S version of a keep-out sign written in blood and riddles. You participate in the Hitandran strikes that define this period. Your group gallops toward the Persian flank. Let's loose a terrifying volley of arrows, including those whistling ones we talked about, and then, just as the Persian heavy cavalry prepares to countercharge, you turn and ride away. This is where the Parthian shot becomes the heartbeat of the war. As the Persians chase you, thinking they finally have you cornered, you twist in your saddle and pepper their front ranks. They can't catch you, but they can't stop following you, because if they stop, you just turn around and start shooting again. It's a tactical, infinite loop that drains the morale out of the toughest veterans. There is a mainstream historical fact that illustrates the absurdity of this lopsided war. At one point, while the two armies were finally drawing up for what looked like a real battle, a hare jumped out of the grass between the lines. The Scythian warriors, instead of focusing on the 700,000 Persians in front of them, immediately broke ranks and began a loud, cheering hunt for the rabbit. When Darius heard the commotion and realized they cared more about a rabbit than his entire empire, he finally understood that he could never truly defeat a people who did unfear his power or respect his rules of engagement. He ordered a retreat that night, leaving his campfires burning to trick you while he slipped away in the dark. You watched the remains of the Persian army limp back toward the Danube, their numbers decimated not by a great battle, but by hunger, thirst, and the constant rhythmic thwack of arrows coming from a foe they could never look in the eye. You realize that the Scythians have invented a new kind of victory. It isn't about holding ground, it's about making the ground itself unholdable. You look down at your bow, now realizing it's not just a weapon for hunting deer, but a tool for deconstructing an empire. The feeling of power is intoxicating. You aren't a barbarian hiding in the hills. You are a master of space and time. You can cover 50 miles in a day, find a hidden spring that only your people know about, and disappear into the tall grass before the enemy's dust has even settled. You've seen how the vanishing army works on a grand scale. But for this to work, you have to be more than just fast. You have to be a master of psychology. You have to know exactly how to make a disciplined enemy lose their mind and charge into a trap. As you sit by a small hidden campfire tonight, the smell of the charred steppe still clinging to your hair, you think about the Persians. They are the most sophisticated military on the planet, and they were beaten by a rabbit hunt and a few thousand arrows fired backward. You're beginning to understand that the Parthian shot wasn't just a physical move. It was the ultimate bait. Tomorrow, you'll learn the art of the feigned retreats, the psychological trap that has led countless armies, including the pride of Rome. The morning mist on the steppe is thick and cold, sticking to the wool of your trousers and the whiskers of your horse. You're riding in the vanguard today, part of a small, tempting bait unit. Your commanders have explained the plan, but your heart still hammers against your ribs. Today, you aren't just a ghost, you are a siren. You are going to look a disciplined enemy in the eye, pretend to break, and lead them into a slaughter. This is the art of the feigned retreat, a maneuver that requires more discipline than a standard charge ever could. To do this, you have to be a master actor. You have to convince a battle-hardened general that you are truly, deeply terrified. You see the enemy formation ahead, perhaps a stubborn detachment of Greek hoplites or Persian heavy infantry. They are a wall of bronze and wood, their spears leveled like the quills of a giant porcupine. You probably wouldn't survive a hidden collision with that wall. Their weight alone would roll over you like a tide. So, you do the opposite. You gallop forward, shouting, loosing a few lazy arrows that bounce harmlessly off their shields. Then, on a signal that sounds like a shrill bird call, your entire line panics. You turn your horses around, screaming in feigned distress, and begin a frantic, disorganized flight. You make sure to drop a few pieces of loot, a colorful saddle blanket here, a decorative cup there, to sell the image of a total rout. Historians still argue whether the feigned retreat is the single most difficult cavalry maneuver to execute without it turning into a real retreat. If your men get too scared, they actually run away. If they don't look scared enough, the enemy smells the trap. You have to maintain a precise distance, just far enough away that they think they can catch you, but close enough that they feel the heat of the chase. You look over your shoulder and you see them. The enemy commander has taken the bait. He sees your broken line and hears the panicked cries, and he gives the order. The wall of bronze shatters as his men break formation to sprint after you, desperate to cut down the cowards before they reach the horizon. There is a mainstream historical fact that makes this so lethal. An army is a machine, and a machine only works when the parts are connected. By luring them out of their formation, you have turned a disciplined unit into a collection of individuals. Once they are scattered and breathless from the chase, they are no longer an army, they are targets. You lead them for miles, drawing them further and further away from their supply lines and their support. You feel the rhythm of the horse beneath you, and you wait for the snap. One quirky fringe tidbit about these retreats is that Scythian commanders would often use invisible signals to coordinate the turnaround. While the enemy heard shouting and chaos, the Scythian riders were watching the movement of a specific banner or listening for a specific frequency on a bone whistle that the enemy's ears, ringing from the din of battle, simply couldn't pick up. It was a symphony of deception, played out over miles of open ground. You realize that you aren't just running, you are navigating a very long, very fast trap. Suddenly, the signal changes. The bird call becomes a sharp, piercing blast. In a heartbeat, the panicked flight vanishes. You and your comrades wheel your horses around with the synchronized grace of a school of fish. The enemy pursuers, now miles from their base and gasping for air, freeze. They realize, with a cold sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they aren't the hunters. They are the prey. You don't charge them with spears. You don't give them the honorable hand-to-hand fight they want. You simply circle them, and that's when the Parthian shot returns to the stage. You twist in your saddle, and this time, your aim is true. The arrows fly thick and fast, catching the enemy in their unshielded sides and backs. They try to reform their line, but there is no line left. They are standing in the middle of a vacuum, surrounded by a whirlwind of horsemen who are moving too fast to hit. You see the look of haunting realization in their eyes, the same look that would later define the Roman experience at the Battle of Carrhae. They have been outplayed not by strength, but by the psychology of greed and the physics of the bow. Remember that soft seat we talked about? This is where it saves your life. As you circle the dying formation, your body stays level, allowing you to pick off the officers first. You see a centurion-type figure trying to rally his men, and you send an arrow through the gap in his greaves. He falls, and with him, the last bit of the enemy's resolve. You realize that the feigned retreat isn't just a move, it's a philosophy. It's the belief that the enemy's own momentum is your best weapon. You are simply the mirror that reflects their aggression back at them. The battle, if you can even call it, that is over quickly. There is no glorious clash of swords, just the rhythmic thwack of the bow and the heavy silence of the fallen. You feel a strange sense of detachment. You didn't even break a sweat, while the men on the ground worked themselves to death just trying to reach you. It's a clean, clinical way to kill, and it leaves you feeling more like a predator than a soldier. As you ride back toward the main camp, the sun setting behind you in a blaze of violet and gold, you look at your bow. It's still warm from the friction of the string. You've learned the move, the physics, and the psychology. But there is one more layer to the Scythian terrors, something that ensured that even a minor wound from one of your arrows was a death sentence. You look at the dark, sticky substance in a small pot attached to your belt. It's time to talk about Scythian, the toxic secret that made the Parthian shot a literal nightmare. The sun has fully dipped below the horizon now, leaving the steppe in a deep, bruised purple. You sit by your small fire, but you aren't cooking. You are performing a ritual that most civilized soldiers would find utterly abhorrent. In front of you is a small, tightly sealed ceramic jar. You handle it with the kind of practiced caution a modern person might reserve for a vial of nitroglycerin. This is the source of the Scythian death mista, infamous Scythian. While the Greeks and Romans spoke of the horse archer's skill with a mix of respect and frustration, they spoke of their poison with pure, unadulterated terror. You probably wouldn't survive the night if you accidentally nicked your finger while preparing this, because Scythian isn't just a toxin. It is a biological weapon designed to ensure that even the smallest scratch becomes a slow, agonizing journey to the grave. You take a bundle of those trilobate bronze arrowheads we saw earlier and begin to carefully dip the tips into the jar. The mixture is dark, thick, and smells like a charnel house. Historians still argue whether the exact recipe recorded by ancient authors like Pseudo-Aristotle was an exaggeration, but modern toxicology suggests the Scythians knew exactly what they were doing. The base of the poison was a mixture of decomposed viper venom and the putrefied remains of human blood and feces. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was a calculated piece of chemical engineering. The snake venom targeted the nervous system and the heart. while the putrefied organic matter introduced a lethal cocktail of Clostridium and Streptococcus bacteria directly into the bloodstream as you coat the blades. You realize that this poison transformed the Parthian shot from a tactical maneuver into a psychological plague. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores this. Many Roman soldiers who survived the initial hail of arrows in later centuries would die days later from rampant gangrene and septicemia. The arrows didn't have to hit a vital organ to kill you, they just had to touch you. You see a warrior nearby testing the sharpness of his arrow on a piece of leather, his movements slow and deliberate. He knows that his quiver is a mobile biohazard lab. In the heat of battle, the mere sight of a Scythian archer reaching for an arrow was enough to induce a paralyzing dread. Knowing that armor might stop the impact, but it couldn't stop the infection. One quirky fringe tidbit about Scythicon is the belief that the Scythians would actually grow the poison in the carcasses of dead animals, specifically snakes that were left to rot in sealed containers. This wasn't just about the venom, it was about the bacteria. By the time you dip your arrow, you are essentially weaponizing the process of decay itself. It's a grim contrast to the beautiful gold jewelry and fine embroidery you see on the warrior's clothing. They are a people who appreciate the highest forms of art, but they also have a very intimate, practical relationship with death. You finish coating your 25th arrow and set them aside to dry. You've noticed that the tips have small barbs. If a Roman soldier tried to pull one of these out of his arm, the barbs would tear more flesh, pushing the poison deeper into the wound. It was a lose-lose scenario for the victim. If they left the arrow in, they bled out or the poison spread. If they pulled it out, they invited a secondary infection that was just as lethal. You look at your hands, stained slightly with a dark residue, and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the night air. You aren't just a soldier, you are a delivery system for a microscopic army. Remember those whistling arrows? Now imagine the psychological impact when the enemy realizes those whistling sounds are carrying. The sound becomes a literal omen of sickness. You hear the horses shifting in the dark, their rhythmic breathing, a reminder of the life that fuels this machine of death. The Scythians didn't see this as cheating or dishonorable. In the harsh reality of the steppe, you use every advantage the gods provide. The viper is a resident of the grass, just as you are. Why wouldn't you borrow its bite? You see an older warrior watching you, nodding in approval at your careful work. He tells you a story, mostly through gestures, about a great battle where the enemy retreated after only 10 minutes of shooting, not because they were outnumbered, but because the first man hit had turned a sickly shade of green and died screaming before the second volley even landed. It is a form of asymmetric warfare that wouldn't be seen again with such effectiveness until the development of chemical shells in the 20th century. You're starting to see the full picture of the haunting. It wasn't just that the Scythians could hit you, it was what happened after they hit you. As you seal the jar, you wipe your fingers on a piece of dry grass and then burn the grass in the fire. Even the leftovers are dangerous. You realize that to be a horse archer is to live on a razor's edge. One mistake with your own equipment, one trip in the dark near your quiver, and you're a victim of your own genius. It requires a level of constant high-stakes discipline that makes the rigid drilling of the Roman legions look almost simple by comparison. The fire crackles, and you look up at the stars wondering how many of the men you'll face tomorrow have families waiting for them, and how many of them realize that their bronze breastplates are essentially useless against the tiny poisoned needle you're holding. You feel a strange weight in your chest. The steppe has given you mobility, the horse has given you speed, the bow has given you power, and the viper has given you a lingering, inescapable sting. You are now the ultimate predator of the ancient world. Tomorrow, we move east. We're going to see how this Scythian DNA traveled along the Silk Road, influencing the legendary horsemen of Carrhae and the terrifying heavy cavalry that would eventually support the light archers. The world is much bigger than this patch of grass, and the Parthian shot is about to go global. You lie back on your furs, the smell of the poison still faintly in the air, knowing that you carry the bite that will eventually bring Rome to its knees. The wind shifts as you leave the familiar plains of the Pontic steppe, turning colder and carrying the scent of cedar and high mountain passes. You're heading east, following the rhythmic clop-fed of thousands of hooves as the Scythian influence ripples along the burgeoning Silk Road. You see, the horse archer wasn't just a local phenomenon. It was a successful biological and tactical virus that infected every culture it touched. You're now riding with a multi-ethnic band of nomads, and you notice that as you move toward the borders of what will become the Goryeo and Goguryeo kingdoms of Korea, the Parthian shot is being adapted into something even more robust. You probably wouldn't survive the transition if you stayed purely a light scout. Out here, the terrain gets rugged, and the enemies start wearing thicker skin. As you observe your eastern cousins, you notice a subtle shift in the gear. The composite bows are still there, but they've become slightly more curved, more extreme in their recurve to compensate for the humidity of the mountainous east. Historians still argue whether the specific kinked limb design of the later Korean bow was a direct descendant of Scythian engineering or a parallel evolution. But the result is the same, a weapon that can store even more energy in an even smaller frame. You watch a Goguryeo rider gallop through a narrow mountain pass, his horse sure-footed on the rocky incline, as he performs a perfect reverse shot at a target uphill. It's the same Parthian DNA, just evolved for a different ecosystem. There is a mainstream historical fact that links these distant worlds, the famous mural in the Myeongchong tomb. You've seen it in textbooks: a hunter on a galloping horse, twisted entirely backward, firing an arrow at a tiger. Seeing it in person, you realize it isn't just art, it's a manual. The Eastern horse archers took the Scythian foundation and turned it into a cornerstone of their national identity. You see them practicing with heavy whistling arrows that are even larger than the ones you used on the steppe. These aren't just for killing, they are for signaling maneuvers across vast, noisy battlefields where a voice would be lost in the wind. One quirky fringe tidbit you pick up while sharing a meal of dried meat and mountain berries is the bonanocht arrow. Some of these Eastern tribes use arrows where the nock, the part that grips the strings, made from the finger bones of fallen enemies. It's a grisly psychological tactic that mirrors the Scythian scalping traditions. It tells the enemy that, if they die, they won't just be buried, they will be recycled into the very weapon that killed them. You look at your own quiver and feel a new level of respect for the sheer ruthlessness of the cultures developing along this trade route. You notice that as the horse archer tradition moves east, it starts to merge with the concept of heavy cavalry. You see riders who are starting to experiment with iron scales, not just for themselves, but for their horses. This is the birth of the cataphract style that will eventually haunt Rome alongside the light archers. You're watching the evolution of a combat arms team. The light archer pulls the enemy out with a feigned retreat and a Parthian shot. And then these new armored titans crash into the disoriented survivors like a landslide. You realize that the shot isn't just an ending, it's a setup for a much larger, more violent symphony. You spend a few weeks training with a Goguryeo unit, and you find that they emphasize verticality in a way the steppe nomads didn't. They practice shooting from the saddle while the horse is jumping over fallen logs or navigating steep ravines. It's a more acrobatic version of the Scythian style. You try to keep up, but your steppe legs aren't used to the constant uphill-downhill strain. Your inner thighs are bruised purple from gripping the horse's barrel during these vertical maneuvers. It's a reminder that while the Parthian shot is the universal language of the horseman, every dialect is shaped by the ground beneath the hooves. Remember that thumb ring from the steppe? Here, it's being refined into a variety of shapes, some made of jade, some of polished horn. They call it the male or female ring, depending on the lip of the flange. You're beginning to see that horse archery is becoming a high-precision science. The Eastern riders discuss the spine of the arrow, its flexibility, with the same intensity that a modern shooter discusses ballistics coefficients. They realized that a Parthian shot at a 4 or 5 degree upward angle requires a different release than one fired on a flat plane. As you sit around the fire one night, listening to the mixture of languages Scythian, Proto-Turkic, and early Korean dialects, you realize that the Parthian shot has become a global currency of power. It has traveled thousands of miles from its origin point, and in every place it lands, it topples the existing military order. The infantry-based empires of the East are struggling just as much as the Persians did. You see a trader from the West talking about a rising power across the sea city of marble and iron called Rome. He laughs, saying they have the best infantry in the world, but they still fight in boxers. The riders around the fire exchange a knowing look. A box of men is just a target that doesn't know it's supposed to move. You feel a strange sense of anticipation. You've seen the roots in the grass, and you've seen the branches in the mountains. Now, it's time to see the collision. The Silk Road isn't just a path for silk and spices. It's the fuse that is leading straight to the heart of the Roman Republic. You're heading back west now, toward the deserts of the Levant, where a man named Crassus is about to learn exactly why you never ever follow a retreating horseman into the dust. The horses are restless tonight, their ears pricked toward the west. They can smell the salt of the Mediterranean and the iron of the legions. You check your bow, feeling the familiar tension of the composite limbs. You've evolved. You've seen how the world uses your weapon. And as you prepare to cross back into the lands where Rome's pride is at its peak, you know something they don't. The Parthian shot is no longer a tribal trick. It is a world-shattering inevitability. The air has turned dry and punishing, the lush grass of the steppe replaced by the abrasive grit of the Mesopotamian desert. You are no longer riding through a sea of green. You are navigating a landscape of shifting dunes and sun-bleached rock. You're positioned on a low ridge, looking down into a valley where the horizon is choked by a sight that should be magnificent, but to you looks like a slow-moving target. It's the year 53 BCE, and you are seeing the Roman legions in their full, terrifying glory. 7 legions, nearly 40,000 men, marching in a dense rectangular block that ripples with the silver light of their chainmail and the deep red of their tunics. This is Marcus Licinius Crassus's bid for immortality, and you probably wouldn't survive a direct confrontation with that iron forest. But as you look at your Parthian commanders, you see they aren't reaching for their swords. They're checking their bowstrings. You feel the heat radiating off the desert floor, a shimmering haze that makes the Roman formation look like a mirage. The Romans are confident. They've spent centuries perfecting the art of the heavy infantry brawl. They believe that if they can just get close enough to stab you, the war is over. But you notice something they haven't. They are thirsty, tired, and carrying 60 pounds of gear in a 100-degree furnace. Historians still argue whether Crassus was truly as incompetent as the sources suggest, or if he was simply the victim of a technological black swan event. He expected to fight an army that behaved like he did one that would stand locked shields and die with dignity. Instead, he's about to fight an army that treats him like a slow-moving archery range. There is a mainstream historical fact that illustrates the beginning of the end, the testudo or tortoise formation. As the first Parthian arrows begin to fall, the Romans do exactly what they were trained to do. They lock their large, rectangular scutum shields over their heads and in front of their bodies, creating a nearly seamless shell of wood and leather. In any other war, this would make them invulnerable. But you are carrying the Scythian descendant composite bow. You watch a Parthian noble, clad in shimmering scale armor, draw back a heavy arrow and release. The arrow doesn't just bounce off the Roman shield. It punches through the layered wood and the bronze boss, pinning the soldier's arm to his own protection. One quirky fringe tidbit about this initial contact is the sound of the drums. The Parthians didn't use trumpets to signal their advance. They used massive hollow drums covered in bronze bells. As you ride forward, the air vibrates with a low, bone-shaking roar that sounds like thunder coming from the earth itself. It was designed specifically to unsettle the Roman horses and the men alike, a psychological subwoofer that made the very air feel heavy with dread. You see the Roman ranks waver, not because they are cowards, but because their ears are ringing and their shields are failing them for the first time in history. You are part of the light cavalry screen, circling the Roman box like a shark around a raft. You perform a run, drawing your bow, and feeling that familiar C-shape of the recurve. Fight your muscles. You release at the apex of your horse's stride, aiming for the gaps between the shields. You see a Roman soldier scream as an arrow finds a small opening for his eyes. Another arrow pierces a legionnaire's foot, pinning him to the desert floor. This is the first taste of steppe fire. The Romans try to throw their pila, their heavy javelins, but you are already 50 yards away by the time the spear leaves their hand. You're playing a game of tag where only you are allowed to touch the other person. You notice that the Roman light troops, the Violetes, try to rush out and drive you away. This is the moment you've been waiting for. As they break from the safety of the heavy shields, your unit performs a classic feigned retreat. You gallop away, making it look like you're intimidated by their bravado. The Romans cheer, thinking they've finally forced you to run. Then, as one, your line performs the Parthian shot. You twist your spine, protesting the sudden 180-degree torque, and send a volley of poisoned Scythian tips flying backward. The Violetes are unarmored. The arrows pass through them like they aren't even there. The cheering stops instantly, replaced by the rhythmic thwack of death. Remember that thumb ring and the precision of the eastern bow? Here, in the open desert, that precision is a death sentence for the Romans. They realize they are trapped in a no man's land. If they stay in their testudo, you slowly pick them apart. If they charge, you lead them on a chase, they coup und win, and shoot them while you running away. It's a tactical paradox that the Roman manual has no answer for. You see Crassus in the center of the formation, his face pale under his helmet, realizing that his billions of and his decades of political maneuvering are being dismantled by a bunch of barbarians who won't even stand still long enough to be looked at. As the afternoon sun begins to bake the valley, the Romans are still holding out, hoping you'll run out of arrows. In any other battle, they'd be right. A horse archer usually carries 30 to 60 arrows, and once those are gone, the archer has to retreat or fight with a sword. The Romans are counting on your fatigue. But as you look back toward the Parthian rear, you see a line of thousands of camels. This is the secret weapon that turned a skirmish into a massacre. You ride back to the camel line, and a servant hands you a fresh bundle of arrows without you even having to dismount. You realize that the haunting of Rome is about to become a permanent scar. You've seen their formation, you've felt their frustration, and you've tasted the dust of their desperation. You're no longer just a nomad on the fringe of the world. You are the predator that has finally caught the lion of the Mediterranean in a trap it couldn't bite its way out of. Tomorrow, the disaster at Carrhae will reach its bloody climax, and you'll see exactly what happens when the most disciplined army in the world finally breaks. The desert wind howls, cooling the sweat on your neck. You check your bow one last time, the wooden horn still humming from the day's work. You look at the Roman campfires, flickering like dying stars in the distance. They think they've survived the day. You know they've only been granted a few more hours of hope. You close your eyes, the image of that iron forest pinned by wooden splinters burned into your mind. Knowing that the Parthian shot has just changed the course of Western history, the dawn of 53 BCE arrives not with a sunrise, but with a suffocating red haze as the desert wind begins to kick up the fine powdery dust of Mesopotamia. You are no longer just a participant in a battle. You are an eyewitness to the disaster at Carrhae, one of the most lopsided and psychologically devastating defeats in Roman history. You wake up on your horse, your legs stiffed from a night of patrolling the perimeter of the Roman camp. You can hear the Romans stirring. The clatter of their armor sounds heavy, hollow, and exhausted. They spent the night listening to the rhythmic beating of those bronze-bell drums we talked about, a sound that historians still argue was specifically tuned to prevent the human brain from entering deep sleep. You probably would unsurvive another day of this heat without the Scythian-style canteen of water-and-down wine at your hip. But for the Romans, the water is already gone. You watch as Crassus orders his men into a massive hollow square, a desperate attempt to protect his flanks from your relentless circling. It's a literal box of death. You and your fellow archers begin the day's work with a casual, almost rhythmic cruelty. You don't charge, you just hover at 80 yards. Every time a Roman tries to lift his head or adjust his shield, an arrow finds the gap. There is a mainstream historical fact that describes the horror of this moment. The Parthian arrows were being fired with such force that they were passing through the Roman shields and through their hands, literally nailing their palms to the wood. When the soldiers tried to move, they found themselves physically tethered to their own useless defenses. One quirky fringe tidbit about the carnage at Carrhae involves the use of barbed arrows. Many of the Parthian arrowheads were designed with reverse-facing hooks that made them impossible to pull out forward. Roman medics, working in the center of the square, were forced to use crude saws to cut the arrows out, or worse. The soldiers simply had to rip them through their own flesh to keep fighting. You see the ground around the Roman square turning into a carpet of discarded wood, iron, and blood. The iron forest of the legions is being pruned, one branch at a time, by a weapon they can't even reach. You participate in the final crushing blow to Roman hope. Crassus's son, Publius, takes a hand-picked force of 1,300 Gallic cavalry elite riders in their own right-hand charges out to drive you away. You do what you were born to do. You flee. You lead Publius and his brave Gauls on a high-speed chase into the deep dunes. You can hear the Gauls shouting, their horses lathered in white foam as they struggle through the sand. Then, you perform the perfect Parthian shot. You twist, you release, and you watch the lead rider tumble. Then your comrades wheel around. And the heavy Parthian cataphracts, those armored titans we saw evolving in the east, merge from behind a dune to finish the job. Publius's head is soon on the tip of a spear, being paraded in front of his father's remaining troops. The sight of the general's son's head breaks the Roman spirit. You see the discipline that built an empire begin to dissolve into raw, primal panic. The Romans try to retreat toward the town of Carrhae under the cover of darkness, but they are weighted down by their own wounded. You spend the night in the saddle, the whistling arrows acting as a constant reminder that you are still there, watching and waiting in the dark. It's the ultimate expression of the haunting. The Romans feel like they are fighting a natural disaster, something as inescapable as a tide or a sandstorm. By the time the sun rises again, the Roman army has fractured into small, desperate groups. Crassus himself is lured into a peace parley that is really just another trap. Historians still debate the exact details of his death, but the most famous and perhaps most fitting legend says the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat as a sarcastic tribute to his legendary greed. Whether it's true or not, the message was clear. Rome's gold and Rome's iron were useless against the Scythian bow. You see the remaining 10,000 Roman prisoners being marched east not to be killed, but to be used as border guards in the far reaches of the Parthian Empire. You ride across the battlefield after the fighting has stopped. It's a surreal landscape. The desert is littered with thousands of scuta, the on-separate shields of Rome now looking like pincushions. You pick up a discarded Roman gladius and realize how heavy and limited it is. It's a weapon for a man who stands still. You look at your composite bow, light as a feather and twice as deadly, and feel a surge of pride. You've helped prove that the modern world of cities and infantry is fragile. Remember the camel train we saw yesterday? It's still there, moving slowly among the dead, its drivers collecting unused arrows. The logistics of this victory were just as impressive as the tactics. You realize that Carrhae wasn't a fluke. It was a demonstration of a superior system. The Romans relied on a static defense and a singular way of fighting, while you relied on mobility, psychology, and an endless supply of high-velocity projectiles. You've seen the haunting reach its zenith as you prepare to move back toward the cooler highlands. You look one last time at the dust settling over the graves of 20,000 legionaries. You realize that Rome will never forget this day. They will spend the next 300 years trying to figure out how to stop the Parthian shot. But the more they try to adapt, the more they realize that you can't defeat the wind. You've changed the map of the world. The Roman expansion into the east has been halted, not by a wall, but by a 180-degree turn in a saddle. Tonight, the mood in the camp is quiet. There is no wild celebration, just the sound of bows being unstrung and horses being fed. You've seen the peak of the horse archer's power. But to keep this machine running, you need more than just luck and poison. You need to understand the incredible logistical effort that keeps a nomad army in the field. You need to understand the camel, the quiver, and the silent gears of the Parthian supply line. The desert heat begins to subside as evening approaches, but the work of a horse archer never truly ends. You've just witnessed the total collapse of the Roman square, but have you stopped to wonder why you didn't run out of ammunition? In a standard battle, an archer is only as good as the 40 or 50 arrows in his quiver. Once those are spent, he's just a man on a horse with a very expensive stick. But today, you were part of a continuous rolling thunder of fire that lasted for hours. To understand how the Parthian shot haunted Rome, you have to look past the archer and look at the humble, grunting beast of burden standing in the rear, the camel. You ride back toward the baggage train, where a line of 1,000 camels stretches across the dunes like a skeletal bridge. Each animal is laden with heavy wicker baskets, and as you draw closer, you see that these aren't filled with silk or spices. They are filled with arrow stems of thousands of them. Historians still argue whether the Parthians invented this mobile magazine system specifically for the Roman campaign, or if it was a standard feature of their nomadic logistics. Regardless, it changed the fundamental math of warfare. You probably wouldn't survive a prolonged engagement if you had to stop and scavenge for arrows. But here, the supply comes to you. As you pull up alongside a baggage camel, a tender hands you a fresh bundle of 24 arrows presorted by weight and fletching. This is the mainstream historical fact that modern military theorists obsess over. The Parthians, at Carrhae, solved the rate of fire problem by using camels, which can carry much heavier loads than horses over soft sand. They ensured their archers never had to transition to hand-to-hand combat. You watch a fellow rider gallop to the line, swap an empty quiver for a full one in a matter of seconds, and wheel back into the fray. It's the ancient world's equivalent of a pit stop in a high-speed race. There's a quirky fringe tidbit about these supply lines that you notice as you inspect the arrows. They are untall identical. The supply masters categorized the arrows based on the wind conditions. Some have heavier bronze heads for punching through shields at close range, while others have lighter flight fletching for maximum distance during a feigned retreat. You realize that the Parthian shot wasn't just a physical movement, it was a managed resource. You are part of a high-tech assembly line of death, where the camel is the conveyor belt and the horse archer is the delivery nozzle. You take a moment to dismount and stretch your legs near the camel line. You see the handlers checking the animal's feet and humps. The logistics of water are just as vital as the logistics of iron. While the Romans are dying of thirst in their iron box, your army has mapped every hidden qanat or underground canal in the region. You watch a handler pour a small amount of water into a leather trough, and you realize that the Scythian heritage of being at home in the wasteland is what truly defeated Crassus. Rome brought a city to the desert. You brought the desert to the Romans. The psychological weight of this infinite ammo cheat code cannot be overstated. You imagine being a Roman legionary, holding your shield up until your arm turns to lead, watching your friends fall one by one. You keep waiting for the barbarians to run out of arrows. You tell yourself, just 10 more minutes, then they'll have to charge us with swords. But then you look over the hill and see another 1,000 camels arriving, and the arrows start falling again, as thick as a summer rain. That is where the haunting truly begins. The realization that the enemy has no end. Remember the Goritosta combined bow and arrow case. You notice a specific design feature now that you're calm. The case has a separate compartment for the bowstring to keep it dry and away from the grit of the camel's path. These people have thought of everything. You see a master fletcher sitting on a rug near one of the camels, rapidly repairing a damaged fletching with a bit of resin and a quick flick of a knife. The entire camp is a mobile factory. You beginning to see that the perfected shot was only possible because of this invisible support structure. You feel a sense of awe at the scale of the operation. To move 10,000 horse archers and 1,000 supply camels across a desert requires a level of coordination that the civilized world assumes nomads are too disorganized to possess. But as you watch the banners signal the next rotation of archers, you see a clockwork precision. Every unit knows when to fire, when to resupply, and when to rest their horses. It's a rhythmic, sustainable form of slaughter. As the sun sets, casting long, distorted shadows of the camels across the sand, you prepare to head back to the front. You've got a full quiver, a rested horse, and the knowledge that there are 1,000,000 more arrows waiting behind you. You aren't just a warrior, you are a component in a perfectly oiled machine. You starting to understand that the Parthian shot did unjust haunt Rome because it was a clever trick. It haunted them because it was backed by an industrial-scale logic they couldn't replicate. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the people themselves, the clothes they wore, and the baggy trousers that the Greeks found so hilarious, but which actually allowed for the extreme flexibility needed to pull off a 180-degree turn. You'll see that every stitch of a Scythian warrior's outfit was a tactical choice. But for tonight, you just listen to the low rhythmic grunting of the camels, the silent guardians of your infinite quiver. The morning air is biting, a stark contrast to the oven-like heat of the previous afternoon. As you step out from your furs, you don't reach for a heavy bronze breastplate or a stiff leather terrorized. Instead, you reach for layers of wool, felt, and silk. To a Roman or a Greek, your outfit looks ridiculous feminine, even. They mock the Persian luxury of your wardrobe, but as you pull on your trousers, you know a secret they do, you can conquer the world if you suffering from a permanent case of saddle sores and restricted circulation. Every piece of your gear is designed for the high-speed, 360-degree world of the horse archer. You probably wouldn't survive a winter on the steppe in a Roman tunic. You'd be a frozen statue before the first snowfall. You start with your trousers, the famous anaxarides. They are baggy, made of thick wool or treated leather, and singed at the ankles. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked. The Scythians and their successors were among the first people in history to wear trousers. While the civilized world was walking around in what were essentially glorified bedsheets, You have bifurcated leg wear that protects your inner thighs from the constant friction of the horse's hair. More importantly, the loose fit allows for a massive range of motion. When you perform the Parthian shot, your legs have to twist and grip at angles that would rip a tight Roman tunic to shreds. Next, you pull on your tunic, which crosses over the chest and fastens at the side. It's practical, keeping the wind out while leaving your drawing arm completely free of obstruction. Over this, you don a kaftan, often brightly dyed with madder or saffron and embroidered with the animal-style patterns we've seen on the gold. Historians still argue whether the elaborate patterns on Scythian clothing served as a kind of heraldry identifying your tribe and status from a distance. Or, as you look at the stylized stags leaping across your sleeves, you feel a sense of psychological protection that a plain iron plate just can't provide. Then comes the pylos, the pointed felt cap. It's tall, often with ear flaps that can be tied under the chin. You might find it funny to look at in a mirror, but when you're galloping at 30 miles per hour into a headwind, it keeps your head warm and your hair out of your eyes. A quirky fringe tidbit you notice is that many of these caps were stiffened with a mixture of lime or animal glue, making them surprisingly resilient. They weren't helmets in the Roman sense, but they could deflect a glancing blow or a spent arrow. You realize that your soft armor is actually a highly evolved skin designed to move with you rather than against you. You sit down to pull on your boots. They are soft-soled, made of supple leather, and they don't have heels. This is crucial. Since you aren't using stirrups, you need to feel every muscle twitch of your horse through the soles of your feet and your calves. It's a sensory connection that a Roman in heavy caligay sandals would find impossible. You are plugged into your mount. You notice that your belt is the most expensive thing. You want a heavy leather strap studded with gold and silver plates, featuring hooks for your gorotos, your dagger, and your whetstone. It is your toolkit, your status symbol, and your life support system all in one. There's a deep irony in the way the Romans viewed your clothes. To them, the effeminate trousers were a sign of weakness. But as you stand up and practice a quick torso twist, you feel the liberation of the fabric. You can bend, squat, and rotate 180 degrees without a single seam popping. You realize that the Roman legionary is a prisoner of his own gear. His heavy belt, his stiff leather strips, and his rigid metal plates turn him into a slow, clanking machine. You, however, are a fluid entity. Your clothing doesn't just cover you. It facilitates the haunting by allowing you to be the most acrobatic warrior on the planet. Remember that animal-style art? You see it everywhere on your clotheslines, biting bulls, griffins tearing at horses. It's a constant reminder of the cycle of predator and prey. You aren't wearing a uniform. You're wearing a philosophy of the food chain. You notice a small pouch attached to your belt containing a piece of hemp cloth. Some scholars suggest the Scythians used hemp for both clothing and ritualistic purposes, adding another layer to the fringe culture that the Greeks found so exotic. You're part of a world that values comfort, mobility, and a certain psychedelic connection to the natural world. As you finish dressing, you catch your reflection in a polished bronze mirror. You look like a riot of color against the drab desert sand. You realize that this visibility is part of the intimidation. When 1,000 riders in bright red, gold, and blue kaftans come screaming toward you, it's a sensory overload. The Parthian shot is terrifying enough. But when it's delivered by someone who looks like a vibrant mountain spirit, it becomes legendary. You feel light, agile, and ready to move. You walk toward your horse, the felt of your trousers swishing softly. You've got the bow, the horse, the poison, and now the skin of a warrior. You're beginning to see that the Scythian look wasn't just fashion. It was a tactical necessity that allowed for the very biomechanics of the shot. Without these baggy trousers, the 180-degree turn would be a recipe for a groin injury. With them, it's just another day at the office. Tonight, we're going to sit by the campfire and talk about what fuels this flexible body. We're going to dive into the Scythian diet, the kumis, the meat, and the strange. Hearty nutrition that allowed a man to live in the saddle for weeks without ever seeing a loaf of bread. You're going to taste the buzz of the steppe. But for now, you just enjoy the way the wind catches your kaftan, feeling more like a bird of prey than a soldier of the earth. The stars above the Mesopotamian desert are so bright they look like holes punched in the fabric of the night, letting the light of another world leak through. You're sitting around a low, smokeless fire with a group of Parthian scouts, and for the first time in days, the adrenaline of the chase has faded. replaced by the deep, gnawing hunger of the long-range rider. To maintain the core strength required for the Parthian shot, you can't rely on the heavy, grain-based diet of a Roman legionary. The Romans march on bread and vinegar. They are powered by the soil. You, however, are powered by the herd. You probably would unsurvive a month on the Roman ration of hardtack biscuit without losing the explosive. Muscle tone needed to draw a 100-pound composite bow. Here, on the edge of the world, your fuel is liquid, fermented, and surprisingly potent. A warrior leans over and hands you a leather flask. It's heavy and cool to the touch. You take a sip, and the flavor hits you like a physical blow. It's sour, fizzy, and has a faint, smoky aftertaste that lingers on the back of your tongue. This is Cumi's fermented mare's milk, the champagne of the steppe. Historians still argue whether the high alcohol content mentioned in ancient texts was a literal reality, or if the buzz came from a combination of mild fermentation and the sheer psychological relief of a high-protein meal. Regardless, this drink is a miracle of nomadic science. It provides vitamin C, which is rare in a desert, and its probiotic nature keeps your gut resilient against the questionable water of the borderlands. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the efficiency of this diet. The Scythians and Parthians were essentially while a Roman army had to lug around massive grinding stones and wait for grain shipments that could be intercepted, you carry your pantry with you on 4 legs. You see a hunter returning to the fire with a brace of marmots and a wild sheep. Everything is utilized. You watch them cook the meat in its own skin, a quirky, fringe tidbit of nomadic culinary technique where the stomach of the animal acts as a boiling pot. They drop red-hot stones from the fire into the water-filled stomach to cook the meat from the inside out. It's efficient, it leaves no heavy pots to carry, and it ensures that every drop of fat, the precious fuel for your twisting spine, is consumed. As the kumis begins to settle, you feel a slight warm lightheadedness. It's not a drunken stupor, but a sharpening of the senses. You notice the archers around you aren't just eating, they are maintaining their bodies like weapons. They avoid the bloat of heavy carbohydrates, preferring the leanness that allows them to tuck their knees high against the horse's barrel. You realize that the haunting of Rome was fueled by this metabolic advantage. A Roman soldier, heavy with wheat and dragging a supply train of slow-moving carts, is a prisoner of his own stomach. You, however, are as mobile as the animals you eat. One quirky fringe tidbit about Scythian gatherings involves the vapor bath. You remember Herodotus writing about how your people would throw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones inside a felt tent. You see a small portable structure nearby, and as the flap opens, a thick, sweet-smelling smoke wafts out. It is a ritual of purification and relaxation that helps soothe the incredible muscular strain of horse archery. You realize that your relaxed Eudibist vibe is actually an ancient tradition. To be a deadly warrior, you have to know how to truly unwind, or the tension of the bow will eventually snap your mind. You take another pull from the flask, and the kumi's buzz makes the firelight seem to dance in sync with the distant drumming of the horse pickets. You start to think about the why of this life. The Romans fight for a state, for a paycheck, or for a general's ambition. You fight because the horse is your brother and the grass is your mother. Your diet isn't just nutrition, it's a communion with the landscape. When you drink the milk of the mare, you are consuming the energy of the grass she ate, which in turn is the energy of the sun. It makes the act of the Parthian shot feel less like a mechanical move and more like a natural law, like a hawk diving or a snake striking. Historians still debate the longevity of the steppe warriors. Some burial mounds show skeletons of 60-year-olds with the bone density of athletes, suggesting that this high-protein, sugar-free diet kept them in the saddle long past the age when a Roman veteran would have retired to a farm to nurse his gout. You look at the veteran sitting across from you, the one who showed you the thumb ring. He's chewing on a piece of dried curd, his eyes as sharp as a teenager's. He hasn't eaten bread in 3 years, and he can still put an arrow through a gold coin at 50 paces while riding backward. You feel a sense of profound freedom. You aren't tied to a harvest cycle. You don't have to wait for the rains to grow your food. You move to where the food is. This predatory logistics system is what made the Parthian army so impossible to pin down. You can disappear into the deep desert for weeks because your rations are walking right beside you. You're beginning to understand that to defeat an empire, you don't just need a better bow, you need a better way to exist. As the fire dies down to embers, You wrap yourself in your heavy cap. The smell of roasted meat and fermented milk is comforting, a familiar scent that means survival. You've learned how the bow is built, how the horse is ridden, and how the body is fueled. But a warrior isn't born in a single night of drinking kumis. To be a ghost that haunts an empire, you have to be forged from childhood. You have to learn to ride before you can walk. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the training of the young. LLC, how children are integrated into this system of violence until the bow becomes a literal extension of their skeletal system. You'll see the nursery of the steppe, where the toys are miniature recurve bows and the first pets are war stallions. But for tonight, let the kumis do its work. Rest your back, feel the warmth of the fire, and listen to the windits, the only commander you'll ever truly have to obey. The morning sun is a pale disk struggling through the dust, but the camp is already a hive of activity. You aren't looking at the veterans today, you are looking at the children. In a Roman city, a child might be learning their letters or helping in a shop, but here, the education is purely kinetic. You see a toddler, barely 3 years old, being hoisted onto the back of a small, patient pony. He doesn't have a saddle, and he doesn't have a helmet. He simply grips the mane with tiny, sticky fingers and leans into the horse's rhythm. You probably wouldn't survive the anxiety of watching this if you were a modern parent. But for the Scythians, this is the most critical stage of biological engineering. This is how you create a human who can perform a Parthian shot as naturally as a bird can flare its wings to land. You watch a group of 7-year-olds engaged in a game of horseback. They aren't just playing, they are learning the foundational physics of the 180-degree turn. To win, they have to maneuver their ponies into a position where they can tag an opponent's shoulder while riding away from them. You notice that their legs are already beginning to bow slightly, a permanent physiological change that creates a perfect lock around a horse's barrel. Historians still argue whether the extreme bow-leggedness found in nomadic skeletons was a painful deformity or a highly prized evolutionary advantage for a life lived in the saddle. To you, watching them move, it looks like the latter. They don't walk very well. They waddle like ducks on land, but once they are on a horse, they are the most graceful creatures you've ever seen. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores this lifelong training. The Scythians were noted by the Greeks for having soft and fluid joints. This wasn't a medical condition. It was the result of stretching and torsion exercises begun in early childhood. You see a young girl practicing with a toy bow. It's a real composite recurve, just scaled down with a draw weight that would still make a modern adult struggle. She doesn't just shoot at a stationary target, she shoots at a rolling hoop. This develops leading the ability to calculate the trajectory of an arrow relative to two different moving objects. It's high-level ballistics, taught through play. One quirky fringe tidbit you notice is the cradle board used for infants. The Scythians would often bind their babies to a flat board to keep their spines straight and their limbs aligned. Some scholars suggest this early shaping was intended to ensure the child grew up with the specific posture needed for long-distance riding. It's a reminder that every aspect of life, from the moment of birth, is subservient to the needs of the war machine. You see a mother checking the tension of the straps on her child's board, and you realize that even parenting here is a form of military preparation. You walk over to a group of teenagers who are being initiated into the circle of fire. This is the first time they are allowed to use full-size bows and real bronze arrowheads. The master of the hunt, a man whose skin looks like old parchment, is shouting instructions that sound more like poetry. He talks about becoming the string and listening to the horse's breath. You realize that the Parthian shot isn't just a physical move, it's a meditative state. To fire backward while moving forward at 30 miles per hour, you have to achieve a kind of niemand where your body calculates the wind, the speed, and the drop of the arrow without your brain getting in the way. You try to mimic the way a teenager draws his bow. He uses his whole body, his back, his core, and his legs rather than just his arms. You feel your own muscles straining, but for him, it's effortless. He's been doing this every day since he was 5. His skeletal structure has literally densified in the areas where the bow exerts pressure. You are looking at a designer warrior, a person whose very DNA has been coached by the steppe. This is why Rome could never truly replicate the horse archer. You can train a man for 3 years in a camp and expect him to match someone who has been a centaur since he was in diapers. Remember the thumb ring we saw? The children start with rings made of soft leather to protect their skin, gradually moving up to bone and then horn as their calluses grow thicker. You see a boy showing off his archery thumb digit that is noticeably thicker and flatter than a normal thumb. It's a badge of honor. He isn't proud of a diploma or a medal. He's proud of the physical evidence of his utility to the tribe. You realize that in this world, your body is your resume. As the sun climbs higher, the training intensifies. The children are now practicing blind shooting, where they have to hit a sound-making target while keeping their eyes fixed on the horizon. This develops the peripheral lethality that made the Scythians so haunting. A Roman soldier expects you to look at him when you're attacking him. A Scythian can kill you while looking at his friend and sharing a joke. It's the ultimate psychological flex. You sit on a rock, watching the dust clouds kicked up by these tiny warriors. You feel a strange sense of melancholy. There is no childhood here in the way we understand it. There is only the preparation for the inevitable collision with the empires of the South. But you also see a level of confidence and freedom that is rare in the civilized world. These children aren't afraid of the horizon. They own it. They know that as long as they have a horse and a bow, they are the masters of their own destiny. Tonight, as the children are tucked away in the wagons, you look at the master of the hunt. He's repairing a broken arrow, his hands moving with the same rhythmic grace you saw in the toddlers. You've seen the nursery of the steppe. But there is one more group of warriors you have fully explored, yet the ones who proved to the Greeks that the Amazon legends were more than just myths. Tomorrow, we're going to ride with the women of the steppe, the warriors who proved that the Parthian shot doesn't care about your gender, only your aim. The morning light catches the glint of gold and bronze on the rider next to you, but as the dust clears, you realize the warrior checking her bowstring isn't one of the men you've been tracking. She's tall, with a braid tucked under a pointed felt cap and a face weathered by the same salt and wind as any veteran of the steppe. To the Greeks, she would be a mytho-terrifying Amazon from the edge of the world, who supposedly cut off her own breast to shoot better. But as you watch her easily draw a heavy recurve bow, you see that the Greek stories were mostly sensationalized tabloid history. She doesn't need to mutilate herself to be lethal. She just needs the same lifelong training and composite technology you've been studying. You probably wouldn't survive a duel with her, not because of her gender, but because her Parthian shot is just as fast and her poison just as Scythian dark as any man's in the camp. You are riding with the real-life inspirations for the Amazon legends. For the Scythians and Sarmatians, war wasn't a men only club, it was an all-hands-on-deck survival strategy. Historians still argue whether women fought in every unit or if they primarily served in defensive roles, but the archaeological evidence is undeniable. In some Scythian burial mounds or kurgans, up to 1/3 of the women are buried with their bows, daggers and batlaxes, often showing the same warriors wear on their skeletons as the men. You see her shift her weight in the saddle, her soft seat perfectly absorbing the horse's trot. She isn't a curiosity, she's a peer. There is a mainstream historical fact that supports this. The Greeks were so obsessed with these women that they created an entire genre of art called Amazonomachi. But while the Greeks portrayed them as wild, half-naked heathens, you see the reality is much more practical. She wears the same baggy trousers, the same pointed boots, and the same flexible kaftan we discussed earlier. The Parthian shot is the ultimate equalizer. On the ground, a 200-pound Roman legionary might have a significant strength advantage over a 130-pound woman. But on the back of a horse, that advantage evaporates. The horse provides the momentum, the bow provides the power, and the only thing that matters is the skill of the release. One quirky fringe tidbit you pick up from the campfire talk is that among some Sarmatian tribes, a young woman wasn't legally allowed to marry until she had killed an enemy in battle. It's a harsh, high-stakes debutante ball that ensures the survival of the tribe. You see a group of younger women practicing the circle of fire, their arrows whistling through the air with a terrifying precision. They aren't trying to be men, they are being nomads. In a culture where the entire city moves every week, everyone must be able to defend the herd. You notice that her gear is just as personalized as anyone else's. Her goritos is embossed with scenes of a goddess holding a mirror and a severed head reminder that in the steppe religion, life and death are two sides of the same golden coin. She shows you her dagger, an akonyx, which is short and heavy, designed for the finishing move if an enemy gets too close. You realize that the haunting of Rome had a female face as well. Imagine being a Roman soldier, raised in a society where women were confined to the home, and realizing that the rider who just put an arrow through your neck is wearing a braid and a necklace of amber. It added a layer of otherness that made the nomads seem even more supernatural to the Mediterranean mind. The Amazon you're riding with gestures toward the horizon. She's spotted a group of wild asses, and the hunt is on. You watch her execute a Parthian shot at full gallop, her body twisting 180 degrees with a fluid grace that makes your own back ache just watching. There's no hesitation. The arrow takes the animal in the neck, and she's already knocking the next one before the first has even hit the ground. You're beginning to see that the Scythian war machine was a total population effort. They didn't have soldiers and civilians in the way Rome did. They had people who rode and people who didn't. Remember that animal-style art? You notice her tattoos vivid, swirling images of panthers and stags, blue-inked onto her forearms. These weren't just for show. They were a record of her lineage and her kills. Some scholars suggest these tattoos were also medicinal, placed on acupuncture-like points to relieve the joint pain of a lifetime of archery. It's a mix of the spiritual, the medical, and the martial. You realize that you are looking at a culture that has integrated the shot into every fiber of their being, regardless of who they are. As the hunt ends and the riders congregate to process the meat, you feel a deep sense of respect. You've seen the bow, the horse, and the logistics. But seeing the women fight proves that the Parthian shot wasn't just a military tactic, it was a cultural identity. It was the tool that allowed a relatively small number of people to hold their own against the massive, male-dominated bureaucracies of the South. The haunting wasn't just about speed. It was about a way of life that Rome couldn't understand, and therefore couldn't defeat. Tonight, as the camp settles, the women sit together, repairing their equipment and sharing stories of the day's ride. The atmosphere isn't one of warriors boasting, but of professionals discussing their trade. You realize that the horse archer is a universal archetype on the steppe. You've seen the children, the veterans, and the women. But none of this would be possible without the specific engine that carries them. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the horses themselves, the specific breeds, like the Nizian stallions, that were the supercars of the ancient world. You'll see why the biology of the steppe pony was the secret ingredient that made the Parthian shot more than just an acrobatic trick. You're going to learn what it means to ride a Nizian, and why even the Roman emperor would have given his crown for just one of these four-legged masterpieces. The morning air is filled with a low, vibrating hum, the sound of hundreds of horses shifting, snorting, and greeting the sun. You're standing in the middle of the engine room of the nomad world. To understand why the Parthian shot was so effective, you have to realize that you aren't just riding a horse. You are piloting a specialized piece of biological hardware. You probably wouldn't survive a chase if you were mounted on a heavy, lumbering European forest horse. You'd be caught in minutes by an enemy who can maneuver like a dragonfly. But today, you are looking at the legendary Nizian stallion, the Ferrari of the ancient world. These horses are the reason the Parthian shot became a tactical reality rather than just a desperate trick. You walk up to a tall, deep-chested stallion with a coat that seems to shimmer like polished silk. These aren't the shaggy, small ponies of the northern steppe. The Nizian is a refined breed, the product of centuries of selective breeding in the lush pastures of Media. Historians still argue whether the Nizian is the direct ancestor of the modern Akhal or the Arabian, but its impact on history is undeniable. You see the power in its haunches, the explosive muscle needed to go from a standstill to a dead gallop in seconds. This acceleration is what allows you to open a gap between yourself and a Roman legionary, giving you the space and time to perform your 180-degree twist. There is a mainstream historical fact that makes these horses so special: their endurance. While a Roman warhorse is designed for a short, heavy charge in a set-piece battle, the Nizian is built for the long game. You watch a rider put his horse through a series of tight, figure-eight turns at a canter. The horse doesn't stumble. Its legs are like steel springs. This agility is what allows the horse archer to maintain a steady firing platform while navigating uneven desert terrain. You realize that the soft seat we discussed earlier is only possible because the horse gait is so fluid. If the horse chopped its hooves like a plow horse, you'd never be able to keep your arrow on the rest during the turn. One quirky, fringe tidbit about these horses is that the Parthian kings were so protective of the breed that they supposedly kept the royal stallions in secret valleys, away from the eyes of foreign traders. There were even rumors that these horses were fed on sunlight or possessed a supernatural speed that allowed them to outrun the wind. While that's clearly nomad propaganda, you can see why the myth exists. As you mount the stallion, you feel a power beneath you that is terrifyingly responsive. You don't need spurs. A slight shift in your weight is enough to make the horse pivot, as if it's reading your mind. You notice that the horses are surprisingly quiet. They don't whinny or scream, even in the heat of a mock battle. This is a survival trait. A noisy horse is a dead giveaway in the vast silence of the steppe. You see a trainer working with a foal, teaching it to lie down on command and remain perfectly still while the whistling arrows fly overhead. This desensitization is the software that runs the Scythian hardware. You realize that the Parthian shot is a two-species performance. The horse has to be brave enough to run away from the clatter of an approaching army while its rider is uneven looking at where they are going. Remember that animal-style art on the gear. You see it reflected in the horse's own grooming. Their manes are often braided with gold wire, and their tails are tied up to prevent them from getting caught in the bowstring during a reverse shot. You see a rider applying a strange dark ointment to the horse. Hooves it. A mixture of bitumen and animal fat designed to protect the frog of the hoof from the abrasive desert sand. Another fringe detail that shows the level of technical care these people put into their mobility. You aren't just a rider, you are a mechanic of the biological machine. There is a deep sense of value attached to these animals. A single Scythian stallion could be worth more than a dozen slaves or a small villa in a Roman province. You realize that the haunting of Rome was, in part, a massive flex of nomadic wealth. Rome had the gold and the stone, but you had the genetic monopoly on the fastest animals on earth. Every time a Roman general tried to buy his way into a better cavalry, he found that the best horses were always unavailable to the west. As you ride out toward the horizon, the Scythian stallion moves with a grace that makes you feel like you're floating. You practice a slow-motion Parthian shot, feeling the horse adjust its stride to give you that hover moment at the peak of the gallop. It's a perfect synchronization. You're beginning to see that the bow and the rider are just the tip of the spear. The horse is the shaft that gives the weapon its reach and its force. Without this specific breed, the Parthian shot would have been a footnote in history rather than a nightmare for the legions. Tonight, as you groom the stallion, you think about the bond between the nomad and the horse. It's not a master-servant relationship, it's a partnership of survival. You've seen the gear, the training, and the breeds. But there is a spiritual side to this life as well, the markings on the skin that connect the warrior to the ancestors and the animals. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the tattoos found on the mummified remains of the steppe and what they reveal about the soul of the horse archer. You'll see that the haunting wasn't just physical, it was a mark left on the very spirit of the warrior. The firelight flickers, casting long, dancing shadows against the felt walls of the wagon, and you find yourself staring at the skin of the veteran archer sitting across from you, as he pushes back his sleeve to reach for a piece of roasted mutton. You see it, a swirling, intricate masterpiece of blue-black ink. A griffin, its wings arched in a predatory curve, is locked in a permanent struggle with a stag on his forearm. This isn't just decoration, it's a map of his soul and a record of his status. To the Greeks, your people were barbarians, but as you look at the sophistication of this animal-style art, you realize they are the ones who are blind. You probably would unsurvive the grueling process of receiving these tattoos. Ancient ink was often made of soot or charred bone mixed with fat, driven into the skin with bundles of bronze needles, but for the Scythian, this is how you become permanent. Historians still argue whether these tattoos served a purely spiritual purpose, or if they were also a form of living ID. Some scholars suggest that the placement of specific animals on the joints was intended to provide magical protection or even therapeutic relief for the repetitive strain of drawing a bow. You notice a small, stylized fish on the veteran's thumb, the very thumb that pulls the heavy string. It's a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests an ancient form of acupuncture. Every time he performs a Parthian shot, he believes the spirit of that fish, a creature that moves effortlessly through its own sea, is guiding his hand. It turns the act of killing into a ritual of nature. There is a mainstream historical fact that brings this into sharp focus: the discovery of the Paseric mummies in the Altai Mountains. Because the permafrost preserved their skin for over 2,000 years, we know for a fact that the Scythian elite were covered in these swirling zoomorphic designs. You see them on the men and the women alike. You look at your own pale skin and feel unfinished, like a book with no words. To be a haunting presence on the battlefield, you first have to be a masterpiece of your own culture. The tattoos are a way of saying that even if your body is left on the desert floor, your story remains written in your flesh. You notice that the art style is obsessed with motion. The animals aren't just standing there, they are leaping, biting, and twisting. It perfectly mirrors the biomechanics of the horse archer. The twisted animal motif, where the hindquarters of a stag are rotated 180 degrees relative to its head, is a direct visual metaphor for the Parthian shot itself. You realize that the Scythian doesn't see a retreat and an attack as two different things. They are part of a singular fluid cycle of movement. By tattooing these shapes onto their bodies, they are literally internalizing the physics of their warfare. One quirky fringe tidbit about these tattoos is the use of mourning marks. Some warriors have small, simple dots or lines on their ears or necks. You learn that these are often added to commemorate fallen companions or successful raids. It's a tally that you can never lose. You see a woman nearby with a line of dots across her collarbone, and you realize you are looking at a veteran of a dozen skirmishes with the Roman frontier. It makes the haunting personal. The Roman soldier sees a generic enemy, but you see a person whose life history is visible for all to see. Provided you get close enough, though. If you're that close, you're likely already dead. You think about the psychology of a man who tattoos a predator onto his drawing arm. It's a form of sympathetic magic. When you pull the string of that 3-cured composite bow, you aren't just using your muscles. You are calling on the strength of the panther inked into your bicep. This spiritual layer is what the Roman military manuals could never account for. Rome fought with cold civic logic. You fight with a body that has been transformed into a sacred vessel of the steppe. You're beginning to understand why the Parthian shot felt so supernatural to the legions. It wasn't just a trick, it was an act of faith. As the veteran notices you staring, he smiles, showing teeth worn down by years of grit and hard curd. He points to a tattoo of a stylized horse on his chest, right over his heart. He tells you, through the shared language of the camp, that this horse will carry him across the great grass in the afterlife. You realize that, for the Scythian, the horse and the bow are eternal companions. The haunting of Rome wasn't just a physical threat in the here and now, it was the projection of a culture that did unfeared death because they had already mapped the journey. The fire burns lower, and the cold of the night begins to seep through the wagon's felt. You look at your own hands, imagining the soot and the bronze needles. You're starting to see the world through their eyes. The grass isn't just grass, it's a living entity. The horse isn't just a tool, it's a brother. And the shot isn't just a tactic, it's the physical expression of a soul that refuses to be pinned down. You've seen the gear, the training, the horses, and the spirit. Tomorrow, we are going to step into the mind of the enemy. We are going to inhabit the soul of a Roman legionnaire as he stands in that iron box at Carrhae. You'll feel the slow, creeping dread of facing an enemy that you can't see, can't catch, and can't understand. You'll see why the Parthian shot didn't just break the Roman army, it broke the Roman mind. Get some sleep. The haunting is about to become very, very real. The sun is a relentless, white-hot hammer beating down on your iron helmet. And for the first time in this journey, we are switching perspectives. You are no longer the ghost. You are the haunted. You are a Roman legionary, a veteran of the wars in Gaul, standing in the middle of a dusty plain near Carrhae. Your mouth is so dry, it feels like you've swallowed a bag of unslaked lime, and your Lorica Hamatior chainmail shirt feels like it's made of sun-baked bricks. You probably wouldn't survive a single hour out here if you broke formation. But inside the formation, you feel like a slow-cooked piece of meat. You look out over the rim of your heavy scutum shield, and all you see is a shimmering haze of dust and the rhythmic, terrifying flash of silk and gold. Historians still argue whether the psychological paralysis of the Roman infantry was due to the heat, the thirst, or the sheer alien nature of the Parthian attack. To you, it's all three. You were trained to fight a man who stands in front of you, a man you can push against, a man whose eyes you can see before you drive your gladius into his gut. But these riders, they aren't men, they are shadows. They scream toward you, letting out a cloud of arrows that sound like 1,000 angry wasps. And just when you brace for the impact of a charge, they vanish. They turn their backs to you, and you feel a momentary surge of hope. They're running. They're cowards, only to see them twist in their saddles and send a final, spiteful shaft into the throat of the man standing next to you. There is a mainstream historical fact that captures this dread. The Romans called the Parthian arrows winged oracles of death. You watch as your centurion, a man who has faced the fiercest Germanic tribes without blinking, stares at his own hand. An arrow has punched through his shield and pinned his palm to the wood. He isn't screaming, he's just looking at it with a hollow, wide-eyed expression of disbelief. The rules of war have been deleted. You realize that your heavy armor, the pride of the Republic, is actually a liability. It makes you slow, it makes you hot, and it gives the archers a larger surface area to hit. One quirky fringe tidbit about the Roman experience that day was the dust of confusion. The Parthians reportedly used their light cavalry to ride in circles around the Roman square, not just to shoot, but to kick up so much fine silt that the legionaries could unsee more than 10 feet in front of them. You are breathing in the dirt of Mesopotamia, coughing and squinting, while the arrows continue to drop from the sky with mathematical precision. You feel like a blind man in a room full of snipers. Every time the wind shifts, you see a glimpse of a rider, a flash of a Scythian, arrow on, then the curtain of dust closes again. You feel a deep, simmering resentment toward your commanders. Crassus is in the center, surrounded by his bodyguards, yelling orders that make no sense in this swirling chaos. You were told the Parthians would run out of arrows. You've been standing here for 4 hours, and the hail hasn't stopped. You look back and see the camel train we visited earlier. A never-ending line of supply that tells you one thing: no one is coming to save you. This is the haunting in its purest form, the realization that you are trapped in a nightmare of infinite repetition. Remember that Parthian shot? From your perspective, it's the ultimate insult. It's a move that says, "I can kill you while I'm leaving." It robs you of your dignity. In Roman culture, the back is for cowards, but these barbarians have turned the back into a weapon. You feel a sense of vertigo. The world has been flipped upside down. You try to move forward to close the gap, but the weight of your gear and the softness of the sand make you feel like you re-running through chest-high water. The archers just skip away, laughing, and the thwack of the bowstrings continues like a heartbeat. The psychological toll is worse than the physical wounds. You see men around you simply dropping their shields and sitting down, waiting for the end. They've realized that they aren't in a battle. They are in a slaughterhouse. Historians still debate the suicide rate during these prolonged steppe engagements, where Roman soldiers would allegedly fall on their own swords rather than wait for the slow, agonizing poison of the Scythian to take hold. You look at your own blade, and for a split second, the idea of a quick end seems more dignified than being a pincushion for a ghost. As the sun begins to set, the archers finally pull back, leaving you in a silence that is louder than the battle. The air is still thick with the scent of blood, dust, and animal sweat. You've survived the day, but you know you haven't won. You've been haunted by an enemy that refuses to play by your rules, and tomorrow, you know the cycle will begin again. You realize that Rome has met its match, not in strength, but in a philosophy of war that treats you as an obstacle to be bypassed rather than an opponent to be fought. Tonight, you huddle with the survivors, listening to the distant, rhythmic drumming of the Parthian camp. You've seen the shot from the receiving end, and it has changed you. You'll never look at a horse the same way again. You'll never trust a retreating enemy. You've been marked by the steppe fire, and as you try to sleep, all you can hear is the hiss of the arrows and the laughter of the riders who killed your legion without ever letting you touch them. The red dust of Carrhae eventually settles, but the shock waves of the defeat vibrate all the way back to the marble halls of the Roman Senate. You are now witnessing the imperial hangover, a period where the greatest military mind in the Mediterranean realizes it has a massive horse-shaped blind spot. Rome doesn't just lick its wounds, it begins a desperate, centuries-long process of adaptation. You are standing in a Roman military camp near the Danube, and the atmosphere is one of intense, almost frantic experimentation. You see Roman engineers trying to shorten their bows, and Roman blacksmiths trying to lighten their armor. You probably wouldn't survive the brutal training sessions being imposed on the new recruits. As Rome tries to turn a box-fighting farmer into a fluid horseman. Historians still argue whether Rome ever truly succeeded in beating the horse archer on its own terms, or if they simply learned how to survive them. The mainstream historical fact is the creation of the specialized auxiliary units made up of non-citizens who brought their own native skills to the Roman machine. You see a unit of Palmyrene horse archers from the Syrian desert practicing in the field. Rome has realized that if you can't beat the Parthian shot, you have to buy it. They are hiring the very people who share the Scythian DNA, integrating them into the legions as a screen to keep the ghosts at bay. It's a tactical firewall designed to prevent another. One quirky fringe tidbit about this Roman adaptation involves the Arians' tactics. A Roman provincial governor, named Arrian, wrote an entire manual on how to deal with nomadic horsemen. His solution? A wall of spears, so thick and deep that no arrow could penetrate it, combined with his own horse archers to return fire. You see the legionaries practicing a new version of the testudo, where the men in the back ranks hold their shields at a steeper angle to create a roof that deflects high-trajectory shots. It's a game of architectural evolution, with the Romans trying to turn their infantry into a mobile fortress. You notice something interesting about the gear of these new Roman auxiliaries. They are using a Sassanid style of boa, further evolution of the Scythian composite that features longer, stiffer cius at the tips. This gives them a slightly longer range, an attempt to outsnipe the snipers. You watch a Romanized Syrian archer perform a version of the Parthian shot, but it looks stiff, mechanical. He hasn't been doing this since he was 3. He's been doing it since he was 18. You realize that while Rome can copy the technology, they can't copy the culture. The haunting remains because the Scythian lifestyle is a prerequisite for the Scythian skill. There is a sense of technological arms race in the air. You see the Romans experimenting with the Istra, a portable metal-framed torsion engine that acts like a giant crossbow. It's their answer to the high-velocity composite bow. It has the punch to knock a horse archer out of the saddle from 200 yards away, but it's heavy and slow to reload. You realize that Rome is trying to solve a software problem, nomadic mobility with hardware solutions. Bigger engines? It's a classic imperial mistake, like trying to catch a mosquito with a sledgehammer. Remember? The Scythian poison. Rome starts developing its own medical countermeasures. You see army doctors, the Medici, experimenting with various poultices made of vinegar, honey, and boiled herbs to treat barbarian arrow wounds. They are obsessed with the black rot, the gangrene caused by the putrefied blood on the arrowheads. Some fringe accounts even suggest they tried to immunize soldiers by giving them tiny, non-lethal doses of snake venom, though that likely did more harm than good. You're watching the birth of military toxicology, born out of the sheer terror of a Scythian scratch. The Roman army you see now is no longer the pure infantry force of the early Republic. It's becoming a hybrid. You see more horses, more light troops, and more varied weaponry. Rome is becoming Easternized in its attempt to conquer the East. You realize that the Parthian shot didn't just kill Roman soldiers, it changed Roman identity. By the time of the late Empire, the Roman emperor himself will be riding at the head of a unit of armored horse archers, looking more like a Scythian king than a Roman consul. The ghost has effectively possessed the house. As you watch a Roman officer struggle to command a unit of unruly Sarmatian mercenaries, you feel a sense of irony. Rome is paying for the very skill that nearly destroyed it. They are trying to domesticate the fire of the steppe, but fire is a dangerous thing to keep in a marble building. You've seen the Roman attempt to adapt, to build a countermeasure, and to survive. But the nomads have one more evolution up their sleeves, transition from the light, stinging archer to the heavy, crushing cataphract. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the cataphract, the scale-clad tanks of the ancient world. You'll see how the horse archer found a big brother, creating a hammer and anvil tactic that made the Parthian army truly unstoppable. You'll see what happens when the ghost puts on a suit of iron and decides to stop running. But for tonight, just listen to the sound of the Roman blacksmiths. Hammer's the sound of an empire trying to forge a shield against a nightmare. The rhythm of the camp changes today. The light, airy thwack of the bow is joined by a heavy, rhythmic clinking that sounds like 1,000 blacksmiths walking in unison. You re-standing in front of a warrior who looks less like a man and more like a shimmering metallic statue. This is the Parthian cataphracta armored one. If the horse archer is the sniper, this is the main battle tank. To understand the full terror of the Parthian shot, you have to see it in the context of this heavy metal monster. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer weight of this gear. The rider and the horse are covered from head to hoof in overlapping scales of bronze and iron. You reach out to touch the horse's flank, and instead of warm fur, you feel the cold, hard bite of metal. Historians still argue whether the cataphract was a direct response to Roman infantry or if it was an internal evolution of the Scythian elite. Regardless, the synergy is perfect. The mainstream historical fact is the hammer and anvil tactic. The light horse archers act as the distraction, using their Parthian shots and feigned retreats to draw the enemy out of formation and leave them breathless. Then, just as the enemy is most vulnerable, the cataphracts charge. You watch as a line of these iron riders lowers their contos, a massive 12-foot-long spear that requires 2 hands to hold. They don't need a stirrup for this. The sheer weight of the armored horse provides the momentum. They don't just hit a line of infantry, they delete it. One quirky fringe tidbit about the cataphracts' armor is the mask. Some of these warriors wore iron or silver faceplates molded into a permanent, serene expression of a god or a hero. Imagine being a tired, thirsty Roman soldier and seeing a wall of faceless, metallic giants bearing down on you, their eyes hidden behind narrow slits. It was a psychological horror show. You realize that the haunting has graduated from a ghost in the grass to a juggernaut in the sun. The armor was often polished to a mirror sheen, designed to blind the enemy with reflected sunlight as the charge began. It was a sensory overload of light and sound. You notice that even these heavy hitters carry a bow. That's the Scythian DNA refusing to disappear. Even when they are clad in 60 pounds of scale mail, they can still perform a version of the Parthian shot if they need to disengage. It makes them the most versatile unit on the ancient battlefield. They have the protection of a fortress and the mobility of a scout. You see a cataphract practicing a slow-motion turn, his armored horse leaning into the curve with a surprising amount of agility. You realize that the soft seat we discussed is even more impressive when you're rebalancing all that metal. There is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the devastating power of the contos. At the Battle of Carrhae, Roman accounts claim that the Parthian spears were so strong and the horses so powerful that a single thrust could skewer 2 legionaries at once. You look at the weapon, it's thick, made of seasoned oak, and tipped with a leaf-shaped blade that is as long as a man's forearm. It is a weapon designed for a single purpose, to break the iron forest of the legions. You're starting to see why Rome's adaptation was so difficult. They weren't just fighting one type of enemy. They were fighting a combined arms team that had an answer for every Roman defense. Remember the Scythian poison? Even the cataphracts use it on their daggers and smaller backup arrows. They are a multi-layered threat. If the spear doesn't kill you, the trampling will. If the trampling doesn't kill you, the short-range archery will. And if you survive all that, the infection from a minor scratch will finish the job. You're watching the peak of ancient military engineering. The nomads have taken the raw, natural mobility of the steppe and plated it in the industrial might of the Persian cities. One fringe theory suggests that the cataphract influenced the later development of the medieval knight. As you look at the rider, the similarities are striking: the heavy spear, the armored horse, the elite status. But the Parthian version is arguably more sophisticated because it hasn't abandoned the bow. They are a Swiss army knife of destruction. You see a unit of them practicing a wedge formation, a moving triangle of iron that is designed to pierce the center of a Roman square. You realize that the haunting isn't just a metaphor for fear, it's a description of an enemy that is fundamentally unfittable. As the sun sets, the light catches the scales of the cataphracts as they return to their pickets. The sound is like 1,000 wind chimes made of iron. You feel a sense of crushing weight. You've seen the speed of the light archer and the power of the heavy rider. You've seen how they work together to dismantle the most disciplined army in the world. But for all this iron and blood, the Scythians were also a people of incredible beauty and art. Tomorrow, we're going to step away from the blood and look at the gold and greed. ULLC, the incredible Scythian gold craftsmanship that reveals a culture far more sophisticated than the barbarians Rome described. You'll see that the hands that pulled the bow were the same hands that fashioned delicate, golden masterpieces that still baffle jewelers today. But for now, just listen to the clinking of the armor as it is stripped away for the night, the sound of a giant going to sleep. The metallic clatter of the cataphracts fades into the background, replaced by a softer, more rhythmic sound, the scraping of a jeweler's tool and the gentle bellows of a portable forge. You're stepping into the inner sanctum of a Scythian royal wagon, and the sight before you is blinding. In the civilized world, people build massive stone temples to show their wealth. Here, wealth is something you wear, something that moves with you across the grass. You are looking at the legendary Scythian gold, from intricate neck torques to tiny clothing studs. The sheer volume of gold is staggering. You probably would unsurvive the temptation to pocket a few of these pieces if you were a mercenary, but for the nomads, this gold isn't just money, it's their history, their status, and their connection to the divine, all hammered into the softest, purest metal found in the Altai Mountains. Historians still argue whether the Scythians crafted all of this themselves, or if they commissioned Greek goldsmiths to execute their animal-style visions. The reality, as you see it now, is a sophisticated cultural exchange. The mainstream historical fact is that the Scythian animal style is one of the most distinct and influential art movements of the ancient world. You pick up a golden pectorala, massive crescent-shaped chess piece, and marvel at the detail. It's a microcosmos of steppe life. At the top, peaceful scenes of milking sheep. At the bottom, the violent reality of griffins tearing into a horse. It's a visual representation of the Parthian shot philosophy, life and death, flight and attack, all part of the same golden circle. One quirky fringe tidbit about this gold is its weight-to-warfare ratio. You notice that the warriors don't just have gold in their bags. They have it sewn onto their clothes, their quivers, and even their horses' bridles. Some archers have thousands of tiny, stamped gold plaques stitched into their tunics. This wasn't just for vanity. In a society without banks, your clothing was your savings account. If you needed to hire a mercenary or buy a new Nizian stallion, you simply ripped a few plaques off your sleeve. It gave the haunting of Rome a literal glitter. Imagine 1,000 riders charging toward you, reflecting the afternoon sun off 10,000 pieces of gold. It would have been like being attacked by a supernova. You watch a goldsmith working on a new Goritos cover. He is using a technique called repousse, hammering the gold from the back to create high-relief scenes of battle. The level of detail is microscopic. You can see the individual scales on a cataphract S armor and the tension in an archer S bowstring. This level of craftsmanship completely contradicts the Roman stereotype of the dirty, unwashed barbarian. You realize that the Scythians were nomadic aristocrats. They had the leisure time provided by a successful pastoral economy to develop a culture of extreme luxury. The Parthian shot wasn't a desperate act of a starving savage. It was the refined tool of a wealthy elite. There is a mainstream historical fact that links this gold to the haunting: the Roman greed. Marcus Licinius Crassus didn't go to Carrhae just for glory, he went for the gold. He had heard rumors of the golden nomads and their endless hordes. He thought he was going to walk in and collect a fortune, but he forgot that the people who have the most gold also have the most to lose, and therefore the most reason to perfect the art of killing you. The gold didn't just buy their weapons, it fueled their resistance. You realize that the Parthian shot was the ultimate keep-off Milan sign, where the lawn was 1,000 miles of gold-vined mountains. A fringe theory suggests that the Scythians were the gold wardens of the ancient world, protecting the northern mines from the burgeoning empires of the south. You see a warrior checking the weight of a gold-hilted Achenex dagger. It's perfectly balanced. The gold isn't just a coating, it's integrated into the weapon structure. This connection between art and violence is what made them so haunting to the Greeks and Romans. How could a people who produce such delicate, beautiful jewelry also be the ones who scalp their enemies and use their skulls as drinking cups? For the Scythian, there is no contradiction. A beautiful death is just as important as a beautiful life. You notice that the gold also served a functional role in signaling. On the vast flat steppe, a flash of gold from a commander's helmet could be seen from miles away. It was the ancient version of a signal flare. You're beginning to see that every aspect of their glitter was a tactical choice. Even the greed of their enemies was a weapon they used, drawing the Romans deeper into the desert with the promise of loot, only to serve them an arrow instead of an ingot. As the sun sets, the gold in the wagon seems to catch the last rays, glowing with an inner light. You feel a sense of profound irony. Rome called them barbarians, yet Rome spent the next 500 years trying to replicate their jewelry and their cavalry. You've seen the speed, the power, the logistics, and now the wealth. You're seeing a complete civilization, one that exists in motion. But this civilization faced a new kind of threat as the empires of the world began to build something the nomads could unjust ride over. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the Great Walls. You'll see how the fear of the horse archer led to the construction of the most massive fortifications in human history. From the Great Wall of China to the Caspian Gates, you'll see the world's attempt to cage the ghost. But for tonight, just let the glow of the gold stay in your mind. Reminder that the Parthian shot was the protector of a golden world that the West would never truly possess. The wind howls differently today. It's no longer whistling through open grass, but moaning as it hits massive vertical obstructions of stone and rammed earth. You are riding along the edge of a world that has finally decided to try and lock its doors. To understand the sheer existential dread the Parthian shot inspired, you have to look at the landscape not from the saddle, but from the scaffolding. You are witnessing the dawn of the age of the Great Walls, from the Caspian Gates in the Caucasus to the sprawling fortifications of China. The settled empires have reached a desperate conclusion. If you cannot catch the ghost, you must build a cage for the entire world. You probably wouldn't survive the back-breaking labor of the conscripts you see below you, piling stones under the sun, but you can feel their motivation. They aren't building for glory. They are building out of a 1,000-mile-long panic attack. Historians still argue whether the Great Wall of China or the Roman limes were truly effective at stopping nomadic incursions, or if they were merely expensive psychological security blankets. The mainstream historical fact is that the nomadic pressure created by horse-archer tactics forced the redirection of entire national economies toward masonry. You see a Roman surveyor marking out the line for a new stone fort. He's looking at the horizon with the same care-hunted eyes we've seen before. The wall isn't meant to stop an army. It's meant to stop a raid. It's designed to prevent you from galloping in, shooting your Scythian arrows, and vanishing before the local militia can even find their sandals. One quirky fringe tidbit about these walls is the archery slot evolution. You notice that the battlements on the newer fortifications are being built with narrower, more angled slits. This was a direct response to the accuracy of the composite bow. If a slot was too wide, a Scythian could put an arrow through it from 100 yards away while traveling at a canter. The architecture of civilization was literally being reshaped by the ballistics of the steppe. You realize that even when you aren't fighting, you are winning. You are forcing the great kings and emperors to bury their gold in the dirt in the form of walls, rather than using it to build armies that can actually challenge you. You ride your Scythian stallion up to a finished section of a border wall. It's a strange, lonely feeling. For centuries, the steppe was a horizon without end. Now, there is a here and a there. But as you look at the wall, you see the flaw in the logic. A wall has two sides, but a horse has four legs. You see a gap where a river has washed out a section of the foundations, and you realize that for a nomad, a wall is just a riddle to be solved. You can wait. You can outlast the mortar. You can find the one commander who is willing to take a bribe in Scythian gold to leave a gate unlocked for a single night. There is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the futility of these barriers. The long walls of the Sassanid Persians, built to keep out your cousins, the Hephthalites. They were massive, sophisticated, and garrisoned by thousands. Yet the horse archers simply flowed around them or through them like water through a sieve. You realize that the Parthian shot is the ultimate anti-wall weapon. Because you can fight while retreating, you can draw the defenders away from their stone safety. One feigned retreat can tempt a bored garrison to leave their tower, and once they are in the open, the wall might as well be on the moon. A fringe theory suggests that the Great Walls actually accelerated the haunting by forcing different nomadic tribes to collide and merge, creating even more powerful confederations like the Huns. You're seeing the birth of a pressure cooker effect. By trying to cage the ghost, the empires have only made the ghost angrier and more organized. You notice that the riders around you aren't intimidated by the stone. They laugh at it. To them, a wall is a sign of weakness, a confession that the people behind it have lost the ability to move. You spend the afternoon scouting the perimeter. You see the signal towers every few miles, ready to light fires at the first sign of dust on the horizon. The entire world is now on a permanent Scythian alert. You've seen the gear, the gold, and the power. Now you see the legacy. The Parthian shot didn't just change the way battles were fought. It changed the way the planet was mapped. It drew a line between the civilized and the barbarian, a line made of stone and fear that would last for 1,000 years. As the sun sets behind the silhouette of the battlements, you feel a sense of grim satisfaction. The Romans can build their walls, and the Persians can dig their ditches, but they still have to sleep. And as long as they have to sleep, they will dream of the rhythmic thwack of the bow. The wall doesn't keep you out. It just reminds them that you are still there, waiting in the tall grass, ready to turn your back and fire the last shot of the night. Tomorrow, we're going to trace this legacy through the Middle Ages. You'll see how the Scythian DNA passed to the Huns, the Turks, and finally the Mongols, who would take the Parthian shot and use it to conquer the largest contiguous empire in history. The ghost isn't going away, it's just getting started. But for tonight, just enjoy the silence of the desert, a silence that even the tallest wall cannot truly protect. The stone walls of the ancient world begin to crumble in your mind's eye. Weathered away by centuries of wind and the relentless pounding of hooves, we are gliding forward into a new era, the Middle Ages, where the Scythian DNA hasn't faded. It has evolved into a global epidemic of mobility. You are no longer just a Parthian or a Scythian. You are part of a terrifying lineage that stretches from the Huns to the Magyars, and finally to the ultimate practitioners of the Parthian shot, the Mongols. You probably wouldn't survive the transition to the 13th century Mongol war machine, as their discipline was so strict that a single man's cowardice could result in the execution of his entire 10-man squad, but you would recognize the weapon in their hands immediately. It's the same composite bow, the same sturgeon bladder glue, and the same lethal intent that haunted Carrhae. Historians still argue whether the Mongol version of the Parthian shot was technically superior to the original, or if it was simply the scale of their organization that made it world-breaking. The mainstream historical fact is that Genghis Khan's armies turned the feigned retreat into a continental-scale operation. You see a Mongol Toman 10,000 riders engaging a European knightly order. The knights, encased in their heavy plate and pride, see the Mongols flee and think they are witnessing another victory for civilized chivalry. But you know better. You watch as the Mongols perform the 180-degree turn with a precision that makes the ancient Scythians look like amateurs. They aren't just shooting, they are kiting entire nations to their doom. One quirky fringe tidbit about this medieval evolution is the introduction of the whistling arrow as a command control device. While the Scythians used them for terror, the Mongols used them as a radio system. You see a commander fire a high-pitched whistling arrow in a specific direction, and 10,000 horses pivot instantly as if they share a single mind. It's the perfection of the ghost army concept. You realize that the haunting has become a systematic, industrial-scale haunting. The Roman nightmare was a local skirmish compared to this. The Mongols are using the Parthian shot to erase borders from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. You notice that the soft seat has finally found its perfect partner, the stirrup. This is a mainstream historical fact that changed everything. While your Scythian ancestors relied purely on thigh grip and core strength, the Mongol rider uses the stirrup to stand up in the saddle, effectively turning his body into a gimbal. You watch a rider stand at a full gallop, his upper body perfectly still while the horse's legs blur beneath him. This allows for a level of accuracy that was previously impossible. They can hit a bird in flight while moving backward. You feel a sense of technological completion. The horse archer has finally achieved its final form. There's a fringe theory that the Parthian shot actually influenced the development of early gunpowder tactics, specifically the caracole maneuver used by 16th century pistol cavalry. You see the echoes of the step in the way these early modern riders gallop toward a formation, fire their pistols, and wheel away to reload. It's the same psychological trap, just with a different propellant. You realize that the shot didn't die with the bow. It survived in the very marrow of how we think about Hitandran warfare. The ghost of the Scythian is still there, whispering in the ear of every commander who tries to fight a mobile enemy with a static line. You spend a day riding with a Mongol scout, and you see that the kumi's buzz and the horsedit are still the fuel of the empire. He carries board-stride, pulverized meat that can be turned into soup with just a bit of hot water. It's the ultimate MRE. This allows them to move faster than any army in human history. You realize that the haunting of Rome was just the opening act. The Parthian shot was the key that unlocked the world, allowing a group of people who owned nothing but what they could carry to humble the greatest empires of China, Persia, and Europe. As you look back over the centuries of dust and blood, you see a singular thread. Whether it was a Scythian at the gates of Athens or a Mongol at the gates of Lignates, the message was the same. You cannot hold what you cannot touch. The Parthian shot was the physical manifestation of that truth. It was the ultimate expression of freedom, a way to have the last word while the world tried to pin you down. You've seen the birth, the peak, the defense, and the legacy. Now, it's time to return to the silence. Tonight, as the modern world's lights begin to flicker back into your consciousness, you look at the silhouette of a rider against the moon. He's not moving forward. He's looking back. He's performing the turn one last time, a ghost of the steppe that will never truly be laid to rest. Tomorrow, we will return to the modern plains to reflect on what this legacy means for us today. The Parthian shot isn't just history. It's a part of the human story that reminds us that sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to walk away and keep shooting. The thundering hooves of the Mongol Tumans begin to soften, the dust settling back into the deep, dark soil of the Eurasian plains. We are returning now to the modern day. But as you stand on the open steppe in the present, the silence isn't empty. It's a heavy, pregnant silence, filled with the ghosts of the millions who lived and died by the rhythm of the bow. You look down at your feet, and among the wild sage and dry grass, you see a small, green-crusted, triangular piece of bronze trilobate arrowhead, identical to the ones we saw in the master's wagon. It has been sitting here for 2,500 years. A silent witness to a tactical revolution that redefined the borders of the human world. You probably wouldn't survive a night out here today without a GPS and a heavy coat. But for a moment, you feel the connection to the people who called this freedom. Historians still argue whether the Parthian shot was the greatest military invention of the ancient world or simply the most frustrating. The mainstream historical fact is that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization by halting Rome's eastward expansion at Carrhae and beyond. The horse archers ensured that the Persian and Hellenistic cultures of the East remained distinct from the Latin West. The world we live in today's the division of East and West. The very maps of our modern nations is a direct result of that 180-degree turn in the saddle. You realize that you aren't just looking at a cool trick. You are looking at the foundational architecture of geopolitical history. One quirky fringe tidbit about the modern legacy of the Scythians is the resurgence of horse archery as a competitive sport. You see people today from Hungary to Korea recreating the composite bows and the Parthian twist. They use the same thumb rings and the same hover timing. While they aren't using Scythian poison or hunting Roman legionaries, they are keeping the biological memory of the centaur alive. You realize that the haunting has become a form of heritage. The fear has turned into fascination, and the barbarian trick has been elevated to a fine art. You notice that the Parthian shot lives on in our language as well. Every time a politician gives a final biting remark as they leave a podium, or a friend sends one last stinging text before blocking a number, they are channeling the ghost of the steppe. It is the universal human desire to have the last word, to be the one who strikes while the enemy thinks they have finally won. You're beginning to see that the Scythians didn't just invent a move, they tapped into a fundamental part of the human psyche, the power of the strategic exit. There is a mainstream historical fact that brings the story full circle. The Scythians did die out so much as they melted into the populations that followed them. Their DNA is still there in the people of Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Iran. The ghost isn't just in the history books. It's in the blood of the people still living on the edges of the Great Grass Sea. You look at the horizon, and for a split second, the shimmering heat makes you see a silhouette rider, a pointed cap, and a bow being drawn over a horse's tail. It's a mirage, but it's a mirage with 25 centuries of momentum behind it. You realize that the haunting of Rome was just one chapter in a much longer story of human mobility versus human stability. The horse archer represents the eternal challenge to the wall, the city, and the state. They remind us that no matter how much stone we pile up, and no matter how many laws we write, there will always be something out there that we cannot catch and cannot control. The Parthian shot is the ultimate symbol of that untamable spirit. As the sun begins to set on our journey, casting a long golden light over the modern steppe, you feel a sense of peace. You've seen the engineering of the bow, the biology of the horse, the psychology of the feigned retreat, and the legacy of the walls. You've walked in the boots of the archer and the sandals of the legionary. You've seen how a single, perfected move can bring an empire to its knees and change the world forever. The light is fading now, the golden hour, passing into a deep, cool twilight that settles over the grass like a soft blanket. You can hear the wind whispering through the stalks, a sound that has changed since the first Scythian took his first gallop across this sea of green. The tension of the day is melting away, the thwack of the bowstring replaced by the gentle rustle of the earth at rest. You feel the weight of the centuries, but it's a comfortable weight, like a heavy kaftan on a cold night. The horses have all been picketed, the fires have burned down to glowing embers, and the horizon has finally stopped moving. Everything is still now. The iron forest of the legions has long since turned to dust, and the golden glitter of the nomad kings is tucked safely away in the silence of the earth. You are safe, you are warm, and you are far away from the heat of the desert and the sting of the arrow. Let your breath slow down, matching the rhythmic, easy pace of a horse walking home after a long day's ride. The journey is over, the story is told, and the ghosts of the steppe are finally at peace, watching over the endless grass from the safety of the stars. Now, take a deep breath of that cool night air and let the images of the archers and the empires fade into a soft gray mist. The world is quiet, the grass is still, and there are no more shots to fire. It's time to let go of the reins, lean back into the furs, and drift away with the wind.